He is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution.
Right, right. What's up? What's going on, people? Hope everybody's well. Welcome back to the to the man, to the Onyx Report. Oh man, this has already been a crazy day, but it's a good day, so I ain't complaining about nothing. It is what it is. But I'm running one way to the other. Anyway, welcome back to the Onyx Report, where black male justice advocates uplift black men and boys using critical analysis. Hope everybody is good. See a number of early people. Shout out to Layman's Journal. I got to check your latest, man. I had to do some running when you dropped it. So support the Layman's Journal channel. What's up, Donnie? What's up, Barry? No one, what's going on? Indigo, what's good? Right? Brother Truth, what's going on? Mark, what's going on, Mark? Check out Mark Tuggle. Support the brother. He's got a new book out. Put the information in the comment section when you get a chance, man. So shout out to him. All right, Spain man, what's going up? What's going on? Like, share, subscribe, join, and donate. Support the channel if you will, so we can continue to bring you this independent black male thought. Shout out to Tim, who already drops an early one. It's becoming less about black men and men in general and more about money. Money always ruined the purpose unless it was about money from the beginning. All right. Shout out to Raheem. What's good, Aquateki? Dukek, what's up? Got Barry in the house. Appreciate that tuition drop, he calls it. That's what's up. AB in the house. Busy Mike, what's going on? You know, toxic masculinist. What's going on? So a number of brothers in here. Tim Howard, what's going on? Appreciate that support, y'all. So anyway, we're going to jump in. Y'all know what it is. You saw me ask the question about whether or not there is a current attempt to create a politically correct manosphere. All right. Shout out to Dr. Thunder. What's going on? Yeah, man. This is what we're dealing with. So today, one of the things I wanted to look at is some of the stuff I've been running across lately. And I've noticed a slightly different trend as it pertains to how men's issues are articulated in certain spaces. And I think it's an attempt to, pull some of the best arguments out of some of these manosphere spaces and kind of reframe them, rewash them, paint them up, present them in a different garb and a different way so as to not upset people or hurt people's feelings, so on and so forth. Shout out to D. Scott. What's going on? Right. So one of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to play a couple of interviews, a couple of presentations from one Richard Reeves. And this is someone who has come on the scene in the last year, kind of blown up in a way. I did purchase his book of Boys and Men. I haven't finished going through it yet. So I'm not going to really get on his book today. I'll do that in a future show. But what I will do is respond to some of the things that he's actually argued. And you're going to see why I call it a politically correct manosphere. And because I'm noticing a tactic that I'm seeing with more than just one person. It's a few people I'm seeing this with where, again, they're pulling talking points that sound real familiar, but then they're openly disassociating themselves from the space. And we've even seen this from within the space because, to be associated with the manosphere in and of itself can be deemed a problem, right? But at the same time, I think the reason that you have so many people that are paying attention, even if it's from the clouds, is because the arguments do have merit. It's just a matter of trying to find, the particular types of content creators that articulate the argument in a way that, resonates with you. And, depending on, what level of labor you're doing, what kind of work you're engaged in, even what kind of activism or political work, trying to find the kind of person that can articulate it in a way that's respectable in the space you operate in is a whole nother conversation. See, the thing about the manosphere, it didn't come into being with a focus on being a corporate, kind of entity. It didn't come into being with the sense of how it can be received, lauded, and supported by corporations or nonprofits. It didn't come from any of that. It came from men on the ground, right? Men who had access to social media, and all you needed for access was, computer and the internet or a smartphone. That was pretty much it, right? So you have this thing that's manifesting and developing on its own as a grassroots endeavor, but it's not being governed by any particular institution or any particular sets of institutions. I've said this before. The only institution that's probably weighed in the most on how the manosphere has developed is probably YouTube itself. So when YouTube said you can't say certain words, if you wanted to be monetized, that you saw men adjust to that. You saw content creators adjust to that. That's the only kind of institutional influence that I've really seen. And it was even more raw when YouTube wasn't even monetizing any of this, right? The most you did is you saw channels just basically try not to get, dismissed altogether, right? And then there was a whole nother wave where you had this push by a number of feminists in particular to get rid of some men's channels. There was a whole push for that. A lot of people lost their channels, had to start back from scratch. Then you saw brothers having several different channels, and that's kind of how that kind of evolved. But at the end of the day, there's no major influence coming from any established space that's been approved of by the mainstream. And so the mainstream is still trying to reconcile itself with how to interpret the manosphere. Now, we know in general that the attitude about the manosphere is that it's just a place for sexists and misogynists and so on and so forth. And the Black manosphere is a whole different segment unto itself, right? And so people are, trying to figure out the differences and barely recognizing that. It really wasn't until Kevin went mainstream that became a question unto itself. But at the end of the day, you have people trying to figure out what exactly this thing is and how can we, use it. I've had people reach out to me and try and figure out if I can help them sling products on my channel. And then the whole question is, can he, is this something that's going to blow back on us or work for us? You see capital trying to figure out how to relate to all of these different content creators who are advocating for men, but not doing so in a way that's been, appreciated by the mainstream, right? So that said, this is the question on the table. So I'm gonna focus on an interview, and I'm gonna cover two. And I'll just stop along the way here and there to bring it in and talk about it. But this is an interview with Dr. Richard Reeves on Bill Maher. All right, so let me go ahead and bring this in.
An author of the book of Boys and...
Hold on 1 second. Go ahead and turn this off, since my little mixer has been acting interesting. All right, so here we go.
Richard? First up, he is the senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and author of the book of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. Richard Reeves. Richard? Wow. Yeah. You look like a model of the modern male.
Thank you, you too.
Oh, I appreciate that. So
now, even though he's joking, that's still an interesting observation in and of itself. The model of the modern male, right? This is just an offhanded comment, right? Not to make too much of it, but notice just in saying that, who he's talking to and who he isn't, because the model of the modern male doesn't look like it should come from, these kind of spaces, right? Particularly spaces that, where Black men congregate and have conversations. So you can tell who they're paying attention to and who they're not. And even though Reeves does acknowledge Tommy Curry, that's about it. But let's continue.
The first thing I want to ask you about this book, reading about it and then about it, the book itself, and then about it, is that just broaching this subject, which is really non-controversial in the sense that it is really happening. Mm-hmm. The modern male really is in trouble. We have statistics and data, but just covering this is somehow dangerous for the author. Could you explain that?
Yeah, that was the fear. That was what people said to me before writing it, is if you just write about boys and men, people will assume that you're Josh Hawley, effectively, that you're just part of the manosphere, right. You're on the alt-right. And the more people said that, the more...
Notice how he said the manosphere and the alt-right were synonymous, right? That's where that is. So, and the thing about it is, you got people that aren't even affiliated with any type of manosphere. If they bring up men, right, they're automatically associated. So Bill and Richard here are absolutely correct in the sense that even talking about men will have you identified, mischaracterized, and the question of your public reputation is already on the table.
Or I thought, I really do need to write this book because I think it's an axiom of political life and cultural life that if responsible people don't address real problems in a straightforward way, irresponsible people are going to exploit them. Yeah. And I think that's just a lesson of history. And so I lead with the facts. Let's get to some solutions, and also let's do ourselves the favor of assuming we can think two thoughts at once. That we can think there are problems for boys and men, especially working class boys and men, and black boys and men. There are still many issues still facing women and girls. And guess what? We can hold both those thoughts in our head at the same time.
Of course.
Now, he's accurate about this as well, right? Because one of the things we've seen is to advocate for boys and men, and especially black boys and men. One of the first things you have is this zero-sum game approach where people immediately attack you because advocating for men and boys means you must not value women and girls at all. Now, y'all know on my channel, I don't talk much about women and girls. And I've had some feminists contact me and ask me questions about that. And they've asked that, do I support some of the negativity that goes on, the experiences women and girls experience that, are negative. And I'm like, no, that's not my approach. The reason I don't talk a lot about women and girls is they have plenty of other platforms to do that. And they have for the last 40 odd years. That's one of the reasons I don't. It's not because I have any animosity for women and girls. It's just I've seen a plethora of platforms that they're able to operate off of. What I have not seen are platforms for black boys and men that actually put out data and actually question conventional thought about them. That's what I don't see. So when you see me focus on article after article or essay after essay or whatever it is I'm dealing with that covers black men and boys, that's the reason why. I don't need to talk about women and girls, whether it's a negative thing or a positive thing. They got plenty of other places to do that. But a lot of times, the situations I'm drawn to, very little attention, very little acknowledgement. So that's why I do it that way.
But I must say, just anecdotally, as someone who, never been married, never have children, but I certainly know most of my friends did that, and their kids have grown up, and I've seen that. And I've heard over the years, especially when they got a little older, a lot of times I hear, I worry about my boy. The girl's doing fine, but the boy, I can't get him off Pornhub, and the grades are bad, and I've heard that a lot.
Yeah.
What changed? When I went to college, it was, unfortunately, almost all men. Certainly where I went.
Right. Where did you go?
Cornell.
Okay.
It sucked.
I believe you.
Yeah, and,
Now, see, that's interesting in and of itself, right? I started going to college 1992, 48 years old. So I started in 1992. I was 17 years old. I was in higher education as a student from 1992 to 2008, from bachelor's degree to doctorate. I was never once at a campus that had more men than women. I was never once at a campus that had more black men than black women. So I just want to be clear. Mar and I are different generations, obviously different races. We come from different areas, different experiences. But in my own experience, in being in higher education for that 16-year period, and that doesn't count any of my teaching, right? I've been teaching for 25 years as of, I think it's it might be 25 now. Yeah, about 25 now. I've been teaching for 25 years. Never been on a campus that had more black men than black women, or men than women, period.
Now it's flipped. Now the colleges are majority women.
Yeah. In fact, 50 years ago, there was a gender gap of about 13 points in favor of men. Now there's a gap of 15 points in favor of women. So there's more gender inequality on college campuses today than there was in 1972. It's just flipped. It's the other way around.
What's the short answer for why this happened?
I think the education system actually suits girls and women better than boys and men on average. And we didn't know that because previously we weren't encouraging girls and women to go on to college. So under conditions of sexism, actually their natural advantages in the classroom didn't really show up. But since we've taken the lid off women's educational opportunities and aspirations, they've just blown right past the boys in high.
I've had this is one of the things I had a huge disagreement with Reeves on. See, he comes at this with this kind of feminist celebratory tone, right? Where his argument is that the only reason women didn't surpass the men decades ago is because they were handcuffed, they were chained, weren't able to, and when they were able to be free from the handcuffs, they just blew past the men. This is, the thing about Reeves and others like him is he'll make these kinds of celebratory statements, but here's the rub. He'll soon come after this and say something very similar to what I would say, right? So it's almost as if this celebratory tone is the sugar that you mix with the cough syrup, make it go down well. And in a way, the first few times I listened to Reeves, I was a little pissed at some of the things he said, but then, at the end of the day, I'm like, look, at the end of as long as the patient takes the medicine, I don't give a fuck. But I'll be clear about my disagreement with Reeves here. It's not that the women just blew past the men because of their natural advantage. It has a lot to do with who's teaching and applying the curriculum and the pedagogical approach in the first place. Overwhelmingly, that tends to be women. And so what you ended up seeing, and you're seeing it now across race most particularly, is that boys across race are falling behind. The way, and this is something that, Black scholars have been saying for the longest. Look up Juwanza Kunjufu. This isn't new. He's been talking about this for decades. Right? If your focus is on girls as the model, and it's primarily women teaching girls, it shouldn't be surprising to you that boys will be punished for not being girls. That's fundamentally one of the things we're seeing happening. The ideal student is being conceptualized as a female, and males are being punished for not being females. So when he says it's a natural advantage, no, it's not a natural advantage. It was a decision to prioritize approaches to learning that were consistent with how girls learn. That's the decision that was made, and the application of that adversely impacts boys. So it's not just this, they were liberated by feminism and they ran, and broke through the tape and boys just got left behind. That's not what the shit is. The very standard, the very idea of what education became was primarily fixated on appeasing girls. But here we go, or at least operating to their strengths.
School and college, etc. And so it turns out that a level playing field exposes who are the better players. And in our current education system,
now you see that, right? That's low-key kind of statement. The better players, right? You hear this. This is what I mean by celebratory tone, right? This kind of rah-rah. Look at women go. We're so amazed. Wow. Well, since you guys are so amazing, we should have to do something for the boys. This is his approach. And I understand it. This is why I'm talking about this whole question of a politically correct manosphere. It's a different tenor. It's a different style. As opposed to confronting feminism, it appeases feminism with lip service. But at the end analysis, they'll still recommend things that are very consistent with some of the things we've talked about in these spaces. Let's hear him continue.
That rewards sitting still, turning your homework in, paying attention, looking to the future, etc. Those are all skills that, on average, girls just have in greater abundance than boys. That's a fact.
I'm sure it is, but I must also say I've heard this forever now, not forever, but for many years, that your boys are at a disadvantage because they have a harder time sitting still. I'm sure I did too, but when I went to school, they didn't give a fuck. It's like, sit still. And we did. You're a boy. So what? Yes, you're a little more antsy. Yeah. But you still can be told to pay attention and told to study and do all the things we were told to do. Isn't it more that parents are just too indulgent?
No, Now notice the critique went to parents as opposed to the pedagogical approach, excuse me. You notice how the shift went straight to parents, right? As opposed to acknowledging the difference. Now, hold on, I'll get back to that in a second. Shout out to Donnie Mack. Says to celebrate your 25 year anniversary as an educator. Much appreciated. Thank you, man. And then real quick, shout out to Barry, right? Says political correctness dilution equals dilution. Every movement throughout history by Black people has been diluted and compromised to the point where those movements were no longer effective, the objectives lost. Right? This is what we're dealing with. This is what we're hearing. You're going to hear, because notice, the academy has been very hands-off, right? But here's the thing. They've started to recognize that there are, valid arguments. This is why that Red Pill documentary came out a couple years ago, where you had the feminists that started interviewing white MRAs, about, what was going on with men. And she went in to really kind of check them and just kind of, do her thing. And she ended up finding out they had arguments that were credible. That was one of the major mainstream breakthroughs as well. So the Academy has been aware of what's been going on, but they haven't quite figured out how to relate to it, how to apply it, how to use Manosphere talking points without being too closely associated with the Manosphere. And this is why people like Jordan Peterson and some of these high-profile white Manosphere cats. This is why there's been so much tension around it, because there are arguments embedded in there that they can't avoid because they're based on real situations, they're based on real accurate data. But then there's all this extra that they don't know how to associate with. So Reeves represents a different model, right? Reeves will kick down the same statistics you'll hear from some of your favorite content creators. But at the same time, he'll do it in a way that appeases feminists. So it doesn't come across as confrontational, even though feminists have been confrontational with men for decades, even to the point where boys are being pushed out of schools and then diagnosed with problems, as opposed to actually looking at the structure of how this is taking place. And we'll get to that in a moment. But let's continue. Fair use.
It may well be that that's true in the classroom. I have to tell you, my experience is similar to yours, is that most of the parents I know are not really indulging their boys. They're worrying like hell about their boys and trying to help them out in various ways. And increasingly, I think parents are coming to realize that the current way that classrooms are run and the current structure of education just isn't suiting our boys very well. So currently, almost 1 in 4 boys in the US have been diagnosed with a developmental disability.
Now see? Notice how he's rocking this. 60 seconds ago, he was talking about how amazing girls were and how they just naturally blew past the boys. Then he positioned it by saying, now, the classroom is not really suited for our boys. Now, see, I've said the same thing for years, but I said it with a different tone. I said that this is something that has been structured against boys, and boys are being punished for not being girls. And I've situated feminism as a primary issue when it comes to how boys are even being treated in these institutions. He comes about it from another way. Again, that little sugar in the cough syrup makes it go down easier. And I'll admit, it probably does go down easier. It's not really my nature to do it otherwise, and I don't apologize for shit. But here's the thing, and I'm gonna bring on Mr. Z probably in about another half hour. The reason that I'm having this discussion is because so far this politically correct manosphere is being framed more as a left-wing thing, right? Because what we've heard about the manosphere is associated with the right. That being said, you have two sides of the argument, both seemingly advocating for boys, but using a different tone in their approach. Let's continue and find out.
Almost 1 in 4. I suggest that might be less about the boys and more about the system that we're trying to force them through, which it turns out doesn't suit all of them very well. And so rather than blaming boys, I think we should be reforming the education system so that it's as male-friendly as it is female-friendly.
Now notice that. You see the pivot, right? Instead of problematizing the system, which prioritizes women and girls in the gynocentric fashion, the method instead that's much more crowd appeasing is, well, we want to make it fair for everybody, right? Doesn't sound like there's anything wrong with that. I mean, how could you take issue with that, right? And I'm not necessarily saying we should. I'm simply observing, right? I'm observing the shift. I'm observing the way there are those that figured out how to kind of actualize some of the talking points and sidestep the critique, sidestep the blowback from people they don't want. Now, I will say, there is a point where the bill comes due, right? I'm gonna go back to Doctor Strange, the first movie. There is a point where the bill comes due, and we're gonna see how these people in future years confront that reality. But for the moment, this is the pivot that they found to not have to get blowback from women and particularly feminists.
Well, how do you do that?
Well,
I mean, how?
Well, one thing we could do is reverse the tide, which has seen male teachers basically leaving the classroom. So it's only 24% of K-12 teachers now are men. It was 33% in the 1980s. Almost no early years educators are men. And so the teaching profession has become steadily more and more female. We've also retreated almost entirely from vocational education, technical high schools, apprenticeships, etc., which on average suit boys and men better.
Now, see, he's saying some of the same things we've said, right? At the end of the day, the downplaying of male teachers, right? The virtual elimination of it has a severe impact on who male students can identify with, right? He's pointing out the same talking points. He's just doing it in a way that's perceived as less threatening, less confrontational. Then he talks about vocational schools, right? He talks about the impact on blue collar education and the lack of it, and how that in turn affects men and boys, or boys and men, I should say, when it comes to higher education. So we'll continue.
But we've retreated from all of that, and so let's bring some of those back. Technical high schools, more male teachers, more recess. And by the way, if it's true that boys find it harder to sit still, sure, you could tell them to sit still, but it might also be a good idea every now and again to run them around. So let's have more phys ed, more extracurricular activity, and so on.
Now he's actually challenging the actual educational structure. He's challenging the curriculum structure, but most particularly the pedagogy in terms of how this is administered. He's actually saying just a fraction of what Dr. Jawanza Kunjufu and others have been arguing for decades, that, you know, boys need activity, and that activity doesn't need to be the antithesis to learning, right? That's a false dichotomy that they framed in this whole discussion, that somehow boys' high level of activity, right, that testosterone, is an antithesis to learning. It's only an antithesis if your ideal student is conceptualized as girl, right? Because if girl is the model of student, then anything other than girl is going to at some point be presented as a problem. And they went out their way to articulate boys' activity and activity level, not only as a problem, but then they diagnosed it as something that required medicinal impact, medicinal shift, medicinal deficiency that needed to be resolved by the pharmaceutical industry, right? So now you got generations of boys, especially, again, Black boys, who've been diagnosed with these convenient conditions that problematize their activity level, as opposed to actually addressing a structure in education that involves that activity level. Let's continue.
Rather than saying there's something wrong with them.
Right. No, I agree, but at some point you just have to sit still and pay attention. And by the way, for me, maybe we should have more male teachers, but when I was in 6th grade, the only reason I paid attention was Mrs. Hill.
Well, I don't know her, and I'm afraid of her.
If you saw those sweaters she wore, you would understand.
I get it. I had a couple teachers like that, but truth be told, I didn't pay attention to what we were supposed to be learning. If that's just, you know, your suggestion, Bill, that didn't help with learning. You know, well, or I'll say I learned something different, but it didn't have nothing to do with what we were learning in class. I'll put it that way.
But
she sounds pretty scary.
No, she was not scary. No, she was sexy.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Mrs. Hill was not scary.
Which grade was this?
This is 6th grade. Okay. You know, the beginning of Bonerville.
Well, it comes at different ages for different boys. That's not an area of expertise for me, but 6th grade is quite early, Bill.
Thank you.
I'm here for you.
Coming from an expert like you, I'm blushing.
Okay. That ended much sooner than I was expecting, but I'll go ahead and play the second. Now, the second is this one I think many of you have probably seen on YouTube. This interview conducted with, again, Richard Reeves.
A number of people warned me against writing a book about boys and men because it's such a fraught subject, particularly in politics right now, and because so many people were afraid that merely drawing attention to the problems of boys and men was implying somehow less effort being paid to girls and women, that it's
Now, we saw this same thing hit us Black men in particular when we go back to Obama's My Brother's Keeper, right? The idea was that he was actually going to be the first, well, he was, you know, the first Black president, but the first president that actually seemed to publicly acknowledge the need for boys and men, right? So that said, we thought in many ways this is a good move, right? This is a chance for Black boys to actually get some support. And what we saw was a wave of feminists led by women in particular who took issue with it. And of course, the first argument was, well, what about the girls? But nobody wanted to actually look at the data comparatively to see why there was a need for My Brother's Keeper. And the plan, My Brother's Keeper, wasn't even, presented as something that should be federally funded. It was supposed to be philanthropically funded, meaning it didn't come from government. And yet it was still considered an issue. To pay attention to boys meant automatically that you weren't paying attention to girls. But the problem was never reversed. When girls got attention, nobody really of any significance said, well, what about the boys? Nobody. Whether you have all girls schools, whether you have scholarships, whether you have funding, grants, programs, whether it comes from government or philanthropic partners or corporate entities, nobody has had an issue with girls getting prioritization. It's only when boys and men come into the equation, especially Black boys and men, where there's all kinds of blowback from within the Black community, but also from the mainstream, right? Because the idea is that men themselves are privileged, i.e., all men are privileged because when we get down to brass tacks, white men are privileged, and therefore everybody else must be, as long as they have a penis. Shout out to Raheem. He says, token of appreciation for putting us up on game and breaking it down so that it's digestible. The fruits of your labor is well overdue. Thank you. Appreciate that. Shout out to No One. Says, I don't jive with the maximum push to vocational and technical fields. Seems like a push for better drones, not an overall push for educating males to do policy and cultural change. Hey, right? Let's continue.
Framed as a zero sum, and it's sort of a whose side are you on question, and you have to be on one side or the other rather than just being on the side of human flourishing. One of the real challenges here is that if there are men missing from certain crucial areas of our society and our economy, that makes it harder for other men and boys to flourish in those areas. We have an education system that has a dearth of male teachers. We have a labor market where the jobs that are growing fastest are ones where we have the fewest men. And in families, there's the growth in what you might call the dad deficit or fatherlessness. As men are struggling in each of those areas, what you'll see is it'll be harder for other men to follow in their footsteps. It's harder for boys to flourish if their fathers aren't engaged. It's harder.
See, so you hear him talking about men struggling, boys not being able to flourish because their fathers aren't there. All of those are credible issues. It's just framed a little differently. See, I would point out the institutions that have been used against men, right? The use of the family court, the weaponization of family law against men, and again, in particular, Black men. Right? He doesn't frame it that way. Therefore, it's more digestible. It's easier to take in. And my goodness, who would be offended by such an innocent statement? Whereas you have people that also, that have a different tenor where we're like, no, this shit was intentional. And you have people that have been weaponizing it to the degree on a micro level, on a granular level, meaning the woman you met several years ago that you married and had kids with, who's upset with you, whether it's because you cheated on her or whether it was because you just didn't create the fantasy life she's been dreaming about since she was 3 years old, can now weaponize these institutions against you. And there are at least two that we have to talk about that are especially pertinent to Black men, whether we're talking about family court or law enforcement. She can arbitrarily accuse you of putting hands on her simply because she might want to get a point across to you. She might want to prove to you that she can do it. There's all kinds of reasons we've explored on this show. And we've looked at individual situations. We've had men come up and talk about how they've had loved ones, significant others, and wives who purposely used law enforcement simply because they could, right? And there are countless cases in regard to family court, right? And then on top of that, where you have lawyers actually telling women to make up, well, let's just call it what it is, telling women to lie, right? Telling women that if you can accuse him of having touched his own kids, you can get custody and child support. Right. So you have the legal, apparatus playing into this and urging and incentivizing women to further abuse institutions they have greater access to, simply on the basis that they'll be more believed. He doesn't talk about those institutions as being problematized or weaponized. He talks about boys being vulnerable. He talks about absent fathers. So these things stay open enough to where nobody, hopefully, will be offended. Because if you start pointing out the abuse of institutions against men, now you got to talk about who's doing it. And now you got to talk about whether or not those people can be held accountable. So far in the system we have, women generally aren't. So to point it out makes you a bad guy, right? But to be a good guy, you just innocently present it as something that just fell out of the sky and it happened. And it's just too bad. But let's continue.
for men to enter occupations where there aren't men. It's harder for boys to do well at school where there are no male teachers to be seen. And so there's a very real danger that unless we act quite soon, that we will set in train something of a vicious cycle. I'm Richard Reeves. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and my latest book is Of Boys and Men: Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why That Matters, and What to Do About It. The overall picture is that on almost every measure, at almost every age, and in almost every advanced economy in the world, the girls are leaving the boys way behind, and the women leaving the men.
See, now when you started with that, that's already a crowd pleasing gesture. Right? Women like that. Makes them feel empowered. It's the same philosophy behind why so many media projects that we're seeing now will have Mary Sues, what we call them Mary Sues, right? These women that come in, they're stronger, they're smarter, they're more morally pure, they're inherently better human beings, better heroes, better people, on the basis of they just exist, right? This is why this is such a popular trend, and we can get into the funding issues behind that, right? How many studios can check off boxes on how many diversity points they can earn early on to get grant funding up front if they prioritize women, girls, LGBT, people of color, and the amalgam of that, what you get out of that mathematical equation when you add up enough points to get enough support for the film project you're putting forth, is you end up with like an elder non-white woman, handicapped, lesbian superhero that comes in and is more powerful than everybody. You can check a lot of boxes with that. I'm exaggerating, but that really is the logic behind it. And that's one of the reasons we see so much of this. But again, it also appeals, at least in theory, to the female consumer because it's complementary. This is what Reeves is doing. And it's not because I think he's a coward. I don't. I think he's just figured in his, in terms of this approach, it's easier if you don't confront and you just appease, because then you can get to the next step. And this is what I mean. He has an opposite approach to someone like myself. But then what he'll recommend, not all the time, I'll point out one of my differences in a little bit, but some of the things he'll recommend will be very similar to what I think some of the solutions would be. His approach to it is, if we sidestep the fight, then we can probably get the same thing on the back end. I don't have a problem if that's your approach. I don't personally think it'll work. It might get a little further than my approach on the front end of the equation. Whether or not it'll actually work is a different question. But here's the thing. He's talking to policymakers. He's talking to philanthropists, government, so on and so forth. I'm talking to you. And the reason I'm talking to you is I want to see Black men and men in general across class, geography, occupation, age. I want to see Black men, sexuality, even. I want to see Black men and men themselves articulate their needs rather than wait on, the ivory tower to come tell people what their needs should be. I don't want that, right? So we're operating in the same war, but we're in different positions coming from different angles. He's trying to talk to policymakers in a way that doesn't seem confrontational, so it doesn't scare them off, and you don't get a bunch of pissed off feminists diverting the conversation from what he wants to talk about by calling him a sexist. Whereas I could care less what they call me, because I'm not talking to them, I'm talking to you. And I want to make sure that when and if any of us are in an opportunity and get a mic in front of our face where we can actually say something about what we're going through, that we have the language, the vocabulary, the capacity, and an understanding of history to articulate our thoughts in a manner that can benefit men and boys, to actually change the quality of life, right? So anyway, let's continue. Oh, crap. I hit the wrong button.
Attention to the problems of boys is Of Boys and Men: Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why That Matters, and What to Do About It. The overall picture is that on almost every measure, at almost every age, and in almost every advanced economy in the world, the girls are leaving the boys way behind, and the women leaving the men. What nobody expected was that girls and women wouldn't just catch up to boys and men in education, but would blow right past them and keep going. Everyone was very focused, quite rightly, on getting to gender equality.
And when he talks about gender equality, he talks about the girls blowing past the men. He frames it as quite rightly. This presupposes the Duluth model framework, right? That all men were in a privileged, unique patriarchal position of superiority, and that they needed to be held back so that the girls could catch up. And then the girls just surprised us by being so naturally brilliant. They blew past all the men, and now the men are these weak, feckless people that need to be helped out. This is bullshit at the end of the day. But here's the issue I take with it as a Black male studies scholar. What you're doing is you're supporting this feminist gesture at throwing all men into this framework where having a penis is the end identifier. Whereas, Black men have had a very different history. A very different history. You don't have a history of patriarchal control over anybody. If anything, you have a history of patriarchy being the primary basis by which Black men are attacked more. So, for me, I can't go with this narrative that he's using. First of all, he's talking mainly about white folk. That's the first thing. But, he's kind of including us. Now, he does talk about Black men and boys, don't get me wrong. But he's very clear when he does it because he says so. When he's not openly talking about Black folk, he's really talking about white men, right? So when he casts this kind of generic narrative history where girls were held back and boys were privileged and pushed forward, that's not a history that includes Black males. And so in that instance, he's not talking about us. He brings us up very particularly, and I actually respect him for that because his work on Black men, I don't have a problem with, at least, in certain measures. But here we go.
Getting to gender parity. It's not that long ago where there was a huge gender gap the other way, and there was huge focus, correctly, in the 70s and 80s to really promote women and girls in education. But the line just kept going, and nobody predicted that. Nobody was saying, what if gender inequality reemerges in just as big a way as now, in some cases bigger, but the other way around. And to some extent, everyone's still trying to get their head around this new world where, at least in education, when you talk about gender inequality, you're pretty much always talking about the ways in which girls and women are ahead of boys and men. And that's happened in a very, very short period of human.
It has happened in a short period of time. We're talking about really the latter portion of the 20th century where this kicks into overdrive. I mean, we can identify it, there are conversations that take place in the 19th century, really in the 1960s, where we see it, really start to be operationalized, especially in terms of politics and government. But it's really the latter portion. And as a Gen Xer, I grew up during this era where I saw it happening. I was in the classroom when these things were happening. Even through college, it was required reading that I had to read feminists that were saying things that were just as egregious as what people take issue with on YouTube that, men are saying, but in that context, saying it and advocating for women and girls, but sometimes without any kind of qualifier, data, context, they just say shit. You know what I mean? Like when I can sit in a graduate level course and hear a professor tell me, oh, Black men just don't care about family. Okay, well, what do you base that on? Well, I don't have to base it on anything. I'm just telling you my observations. This is coming from the professor. And again, I'm sitting in a class where I'm the only male, right? So it's not just the number of women teaching. There are 20,000, or this is according to 2011 data. So it's increased. I put everything on that, right? You have 20,000 more Black female professors than Black male professors. That's one, right? You get more female students than male students. Right. So in every space that we're talking about, it's more female approved. It's more female supported. So they can make these kind of statements and they accept it from each other and go from there. I mean, I've seen lectures where women have got up and made statements about Black men being patriarchs because they ate the big piece of fucking chicken. And that somehow passes as an argument that women will get up and give a standing ovation for, but not one piece of data brought forth to actually make that statement make sense. And on top of that, and I'm talking about one particular session that happened a couple of years ago at Fresno State, you literally had about 3 men in the entire room. So again, on multiple levels, you can see how this takes place. I was talking about this a couple months ago when I was looking at Howard University, and they were posting about how they had more Black female deans than any other college. I think they were celebrating having at least 10 of them, right? And they said that the reason for that is it reflected the student population, right? Where 70% of the campus were Black women. So there wasn't a push to get black men in. I mean, I'm sure there probably is one under the table, but the push was to celebrate the percentage of women. Right? That was considered a goal, end all to be all. But we have to actually look at this. So if you have majority students that are black female, then you have majority faculty that are black female, and then you have majority administrators that are black female. What are the kinds of perspectives about black men that get passed along without pushback? What are the kind of policies that get passed when those graduates move into graduate school and into law school and into politics or whatever else they choose to go into? What kind of judges do you get that come out of that milieu? What kind of policies do they support? What is their base perception of black males? And if this is happening in black spaces, if this is happening in white spaces, and it is, what are the kinds of impacts that'll take place that work against boys and men in general? Here we go.
History. So if you look at the US, for example, in the average school district in the US, girls are almost a grade level ahead of boys in English and have caught up in math. If we look at those with the highest GPA scores, the top 10%, 2/3 of those are girls. If we look at those at the bottom, 2/3 of those are boys.
Right.
When it comes to going to college, there's a 10 percentage gap in college enrollment, a similar sized gap in completing college, conditional on enrolling. And the result of those trends is that the gender gap in getting a college degree is now wider than it was in 1972, but the other way around. So in 1972, when Title IX was passed to promote more gender equality in education, there was a 13 percentage point gap in favor of men getting college degrees. Now there's a 15 percentage point gap in favor of women getting college degrees.
Again, this is also problematized by what we call flat maleness, right? Because the conceptual idea, again, is that, well, we have to hold men back and prioritize women and girls. Problem is who they think of as men, right? Again, everybody that presents as male, right, becomes the problem. And completely overlooking that even just on a racial scope, we don't even have to deal with lineage, ethnicity, class. I mean, there's so many other levels we can take this to, but even if you just took race, black men have a different history. Latino men have a different history. Asians have a different history. To collapse that into male is so fucking problematic because it presupposes that this is a problem everywhere in the world and that everybody shares the same history. But again, when you're particularly talking about black men here in North America that come out of a legacy of slavery on top of that, this does not apply. And what you end up doing with this flat maleness is holding black men back from what little they were able to get. We already saw this happen with affirmative action, right? We saw white women actually claim themselves to be minorities and take the lion's share of it. And what actually ended up coming out of that is this created a new qualifier for black women, because after white women took the lion's share of affirmative action, black women were then classified as a double minority. So companies could hire them as women and black and check off two boxes. Black men became somewhat of a pariah in that regard within a system that initially was about talking about how black men could actually be supported, right? So these are the kind of things we're looking at. So then when you hit us with Title IX, then when you hit us with these kinds of practices that go on for the last 40 or 50 years, it further holds black men back. And then on top of that, boys being deemed to be a threat as young as 4 years old, being perceived by teachers to be threatening, right? That's already a problem, right? When you have boys being shuffled off into special education for perceived behavioral issues rather than the actual academic performance, this compounds the problem that much more, right? And when you have a lack of teachers, not only male teachers, but again, black male teachers, particularly in all black areas, further compounds the problem because they don't see anybody they can identify with. And the girls, both at home and in school, start to develop a sensibility that boys and men are fundamentally unknowable quotients, and if anything, are lesser beings. All these things compound in ways that become extremely damaging to the opportunities for black males.
So the gender inequality we see in college today is wider than it was 50 years ago. It's just the other way around. There's quite a fierce debate about the differences between male and female brains. And in adulthood, I think there's not much evidence that the brains are that different in ways that we should worry about or that are particularly consequential. But where there's no real debate is in the timing of brain development. It is quite clear that girls' brains develop more quickly than boys' brains do, and that the biggest difference seems to occur in adolescence. So what happens is in adolescence, we develop what neuroscientists call the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex of our brain is sometimes known as the CEO of the brain. It's the bit of your brain that says you should do your chemistry homework rather than going out to party. It's the bit of your brain that says it is worth maintaining a high GPA because it will help you get to college, which might help you in the future. And that bit of the brain develops considerably earlier in girls than in boys, between 1 and 2 years earlier, partly because girls go into puberty a bit earlier than boys, and that seems to trigger some of this development. What that means is that if you have an education system that rewards the ability to turn in homework, stay on task, worry about your GPA, prepare for college and so on, then just structurally, that's going to put at an advantage the group whose brains have developed earlier in those particular areas. And that turns out on average to be girls. I think it's a great irony of women's progress that by taking the brakes off women's educational opportunities and aspirations, we've revealed the fact that the education system is slightly structured against boys and men because of these differences in the timing of brain development. But it took the women's movement to show that, because the natural advantages of women in education were important.
So look at that. So what he's doing to suggest the issue, right? And he's trying to place the issue on the table. The way he frames it, it's first an issue where that has an issue of boys' brains, right? Can't get out of that one. All boys go through it. They develop slower. He made it about boys' brains, and then he made it something that we really didn't see until we liberated women to be able to run at whatever speed they needed to. So now they didn't have to be pushed back by men, and they didn't have to be hampered by catering to boys. Now they could just be free and advance themselves in predominantly female taught classrooms. And that somehow revealed how boys' brains have held them back. This is absolute bullshit. And this is one of the things that Reeves pushes, where he advocates for, I think it's at least a year where boys are not in school, so that they could developmentally catch up. One of the things we advocate for over here at the Onyx Report is that there is value in male schools, all male schools. There's value in that, much like you would see on any kind of team endeavor involving males. It's not that boys are incapable of learning during this developmental stage. That's where I disagree with him. It's not that it's that they're incapable and they're so incapable that they need to be held out for a year. That's not what it needs to be. They need to be in a space that embraces the differences between many males and many females. And I know we live in this era where everybody wants to boil everything down to where there is no meaning, there's no difference. I don't support that argument. I do think the reason we can pick and choose when to talk about boys' testosterone is because it actually is a real thing. Boys' behavior is a real thing. If you've ever been a parent, it's a real thing. We casually dismiss it in mainstream culture when it's inconvenient, but it becomes a factor when it's convenient. But I hold to the argument that there are differences, but those differences don't need to be reframed as something that holds boys back, but actually as something that can benefit boys if in the right environment. But again, this goes back to pedagogy. This goes back to curriculum. This goes to actually using things that boys like. Again, this is the reason why Chawandra Kunjufu's books have been out for years, because he's been talking about this for years. He talked about, this man is so specific. He talks about the temperature in the room, the ideal temperature for a classroom for Black boys, the subject matter they should read. What are they interested in? Tapping into what they're interested in. Look, my son, if you sit him down and try and get you to talk to him about, try to get him to talk about what he learned in history class, he'll half fall asleep. Ask him a question about anime. I'm talking dissertation level shit, right? And this has been since he was 12, 13 years old. If you tap into what boys are interested in, you find this overwhelming amount of energy and focus, but it's not considered relevant as long as the framework is against the female model. And that's essentially what education uses, even though it's never stated aloud, right? So when you say it aloud, you're accused of, all kinds of different things, but the reality is that's the model they're using. But if you actually take the time to tap into what boys are interested in, you might be overwhelmed with how much they know, how inquisitive they are. I said this like three or 4 years ago. Oh, crap. Hold on. Wait a minute. Not sure what my computer is doing. Did this before. Bear with me. Ah, shoot. Okay. Hold on. All right, one moment. All right. I hope you guys can hear me now. Let me know. Give me a 1 if you can hear and see me. Can you guys hear and see me? There we go. All right. Thank you. I haven't had that happen in a good 2 or 3 years. Don't know what that was. My whole computer just shut down, camera, and then it came back on, and I was completely disconnected. So I don't know what to tell you. I apologize. But let me get this in. Here we go.
Possible to see when women's aspirations were being capped by a sexist society. Now that those movement to show sexist society.
It looked like they disconnected from the video too. So let me pull that back up. I was simply saying at the time, though, there are ways to tap into boys' interests that don't need to alienate them or push them back. And as far as his suggestion about keeping boys out of school, I think this would seriously hamper Black boys even
Number
more,
of people warned
even more than we already have seen. So this is about where we left off. And matter of fact, I'm gonna go ahead and bring in my good brother, Mr. Z. What's good with you, man?
What's going on, Dr. Johnson? Can you hear me?
Doing? Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm great. I'm great. Thank you for having me up.
Oh man, thank you for coming up. If my system, acts a fool or explodes, you don't need to be responsible for hosting the show. You can just check out. But
Okay.
I wanted to get you in before anything happened. I'm like, you know what? I'd rather get him in now before whatever. But I was hoping to be done with this video, but I ran my mouth. So what I want to do is I want us to kind of talk about it as we watch the rest of it, and I want to get your thoughts on what you see. Now, the reason I've invited Mr. Z to the show is I think he's been kind of referred to as the lefty whisperer?
The lefty whisperer by our great friend BGS.
I wanted to do that because when I watched this clip, that's where the basis of my question came from. Is there an attempt to to create a politically correct manosphere? And part of the reason for that is I noticed in several interviews, Reeves makes it a point to distance himself from the manosphere. He kind of frames it as that group of misogynists and they're this and that. He kind of makes these kind of under the table digs. But then if you wait for a second, he'll actually make an argument that that's very consistent with a lot of what we've heard. Have you noticed that?
Yes, I have. I've binge watched so many of his interviews,
Mhm.
and he does do that. So he will concede. Um, Dr. Reeves will concede certain points. I just realized that he had a doctorate like today. So, yeah, right. Yeah, I was listening to something, and he said he had a PhD from something. I was like, oh crap! I've been just calling him Richard Reeves, and that's kind of a bit disrespectful, but okay. But Dr. Reeves will concede certain points. And I think you are 100% correct, Dr. T, that he is walking on eggshells when addressing concerns involving men, young men, and boys. Because I think he does realize, although he speaks as if it's not a zero-sum game, I think
Mhm.
he realizes on the other end, many of those ladies may see it as that. And so
Mhm.
that's why he continues to stress it's not a zero-sum game. This will help you out in the long run. And let's see. I I I don't think it's gonna work, but let's see. Right? I'm trying to say it as respectful as a way, but I don't. Yeah, they see it as a zero-sum game, and yeah, it's unfortunate, but yeah.
Yeah, and see, here's the thing. My perspective is, I look at this like a chess game.
Mhm,
Each piece on the board has a different set of powers and attributes.
mhm,
Bishops can only move a certain way, right? They move in a diagonal. Knights move in an L. You know what I mean? The
mhm,
pawns move one step forward. The queen can move. But even the queen has rules on how she can move.
mhm.
She can do a lot more than most, but she can't just fly on the other side of the board because you feel like it, right? Each
True.
piece has a set of rules. My thing on this is, all right, if there is a rise of a kind of left wing, politically correct manosphere, it operates by a different set of rules than a lot of the brothers over here. Fine.
True.
At the end of the day, if we're pushing for the same outcome, you operate the way you operate, I'll operate the way I want to. But I will say this, and this is very much in alignment with what you just said. I don't think it's going to work. I think
Mhm,
appeasing feminists really doesn't
mhm.
do much. I mean, at the end of the day, they eat their mascots anyway. So, as
Yeah.
far as I'm
Yeah.
concerned,
Exactly.
you might be able to sidestep a confrontational exchange on the front end,
Mhm,
but when they actually start to feel the weight of policy possibly leaning to your argument, you'll start to see the
mhm,
blowback. For me, the other issue is, I point out what I think to be the major problems, because if you try to sidestep it and create a solution that doesn't address the problem continues. You know what I
I
mean? If you got
yes.
if you got a rat infestation, and you just decide that you're gonna vacuum the floor and paint the walls and make the place look nice, but you don't do anything about the rats, you still got a rat infection. I mean, a rat infestation. That's the way I look at it. But what were you gonna say?
I think I think policy is needed, and I think going to what you're saying, it's going to be difficult to bring that about because what we're dealing with, and I think Dr. Reeves and others that are kind of in that same lane as him, is one of the people I've interviewed. Um, there's also Scott Galloway. There's other people.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to run into the wall of the classism aspect of this, the zero sum game aspect of this.
Mm-hmm.
um, they're going to run into that wall. I think they're trying their hardest to mitigate against the fallout, like you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a major issue, and what we have is people wanting both, and
Yeah.
the equality that these men are proposing. I think they have a difficult time coming to terms with the women actually don't want that. And
Yes.
as Richard Reeves has said, there are second order effects. I'm using his terminology. There are
Mm-hmm.
second order effects to the increasingly egalitarian society. Unfortunately, a really feminist society, but okay. Increasingly egalitarian society. And the second order effects, it's not just the boys that are suffering,
Yeah.
it's the women, both in working class, because he shows, okay, so Richard Reeves, Dr. Reeves speaks about marriage, and he's showing who's getting married, and he's showing the gap, right, between who's getting married and who's not, and it is a class and income based gap. right? So there's that, and an education gap clearly. And you can see he knows what that is, but he
Right.
can't say it.
Can't
And
say.
that's what I'm saying. The fact that you can't say that
Yes.
clearly is the problem in the first place. And there's no way to sidestep that.
Right.
Right.
You know
So
what? And part of the issue is this, the moment you confront what we identify the core problems to be. I mean, yes, we talk about white supremacy, we talk about policy being the basis for what has initiated a lot of this. In my opinion, policy has had a great deal in the last 60 to 70 years about shaping women's attitudes in particular. As far as this, you know, and particularly in the Black community, when we talk about this superiority complex that we've talked about, we talked about entrenched anti-Black misandry. These things are spurred on by policy, right? When poor women can get access to welfare, but not so much the men, right? When men get access to prison and not so much the women. Middle-class women can go to college, but not as much the men, right? When we talk about these dynamics, these are policy-based dynamics, and over generations, they shape behavior, worldview, and perception, right? So when we talk about those things, when you start to push back by identifying these core issues and associating them with, again, not just the women who've been impacted by policy, but when they begin to believe this and they begin to pass it down from grandmother to mother to daughter to granddaughter, right? This idea that you are inherently superior to him. He is your underling. He works under you. He does, you know, as one brother reached out to a friend of mine and pointed out, he said he was sitting with his lady in the car and she told him, Black women lead, Black men protect, right? This is a framework. This is a framework I've been talking about for years. I mean, shout out to Dr. Julia Hare. She's passed on. You know, I don't speak ill of the dead for the most part, and I don't have anything particularly negative to say about her. But there was one speech she gave on a Tavis Smiley event platform where she talked about the Black queen, the mother of the universe, and then she talked about the Black man as the warrior, not the king, the warrior. What we have in the Black community is very much like a beehive. We have a queen dynamic, and then we have drones. This is the best that men can do. You are conceptualized as nothing more than a drone. You can either be a great drone or you can be a trifling drone, but you're a drone nonetheless. There are no kings, right? You're not regarded as a king. I just found out about an event. I'll be brief with this. I just found out about an African-American male event that took place about a week ago. And the two things they did, the one thing they did is they installed a woman, you know, installing, you know, is a West African practice where you drape her and regard her as a queen, and she's given an African crown and so on and so forth. It's this installing process. So that was one of the things they did at this male, you know, gathering. And then the first thing they did on the agenda, the very first thing was they had what was like a pre-conference to the actual conference, right? And in the pre-conference, the very first session was on the Female Leadership Academy, Women's Leadership Academy. And my thing is, okay, this is
at
all
a men's event.
At a men's event, right? And I'm like, show me the women's event that has a king stooling ceremony. Show me the women's event that has a male leadership academy as a vaunted. You know, see, this is what I'm saying. It's a one-way dynamic. We do this stuff because we've been trained as drones in this queen dynamic. She doesn't have to do shit, and she doesn't. Yeah. Right, but I'm simply saying that is a product of generations of policy. I don't argue that Black women woke up one day and just hated Black men. I'm saying there's been a conditioning, and that conditioning is not only experienced out in the world, it's passed down as a value system within families. So what we're responding to, you know, yes, there needs to be a policy shift about it, but then you also have to deal with generations of this in families. Right, where we actually talk about how men are treated and seen within families. I mean, at this point, fatherhood is viewed as what would you call it? An appendage that can be removed. It's not even seen as a necessity. It's just, if anything, fatherhood has been reduced to sperm donation in many respects. Right? Go ahead.
You know, there's when we speak about egalitarianism and equality, we always speak about the positive. And I think what goes unsaid, and I actually also observe this when we speak about race in this way, right? The people that are benefiting, they don't want the negatives that come from equality and egalitarianism. When Richard Reed speaks and he says, you know, women are outpacing men. There's, you know, right now it's 60-40 split in college enrollment and all of those things. I'm like, Yeah, they know that. They don't want it to be 50-50. Now, on the back end, and this is where I speak about on my channel all the time, on the back end, when it's time to get married, this is when things become real. That's when the numbers start to bite them in the rear end.
Yes.
But everything up until that point, they don't want the equality. And this is not a woman thing or Black woman thing. This is a human thing to protect your advantage, right? So you do lip service to equality, but who doesn't want to be 2, 3 steps above the other person, right? We saw this with the. I'm sorry.
No, I was listening to
Okay.
you.
Yeah. No. We saw this with the college and room in the college school scandal, right?
Mhm.
Some of these people were actually donating to lesser, advantaged individuals. But when it came down for their individual children, right, now it's time to cheat to get you
Mhm.
into school so that
Yeah.
you already have the money, but I need to legitimize the money
Mhm.
through you having this degree.
Right.
Likewise,
Yeah.
with the policy that has advantaged women, the policies, excuse me, that have advantaged women over the better part of the past 40, 50 years, they
Mhm.
want to protect that. And
Yeah, they do.
that's understandable, but there is, second order effects to that, as Mr. Reeves would say, or Dr. Reeves, sorry.
Well, and that's why I think we have to create a culture of being able to call this stuff out directly. And part of the reason I say that is we don't do that in the Black community in and of itself. If anything, in the Black community in particular, we avoid directly confronting feminists. We definitely do so with women. We don't do it.
Yes.
We sidestep it. We tap dance around it. We have to develop an ethos around speaking truth to a form of power that we downplay, but has direct impact on most of our lives, right?
Yes.
So I think we have to develop that. But I'm gonna play a little more. I want to play some more Reeves, and then we can kind of comment on whatever comes up.
Okay.
Again, fair use.
Society. Now that those caps have been largely removed, we can see that it's boys and men who are at a disadvantage in the education system. At the risk of sounding boring, let's collect the data first so we know what we're dealing with here. I do think that we should be strongly encouraging boys to start school a year later than girls. I think that should become the default in many school districts because of the developmental gap that there is.
Yeah, see, that's what I have an issue with when it comes to Reeves. This would further disadvantage Black boys, in my opinion, in a manner that we can't afford as it is, right? This is why I'd advocate, if you see, Black male schools, especially schools run by groups like the Nation of Islam or whatnot, you actually can see what Black boys are capable of when they're in a supportive environment that doesn't problematize their very being and present them as a problem. This whole developmental argument, I think, sidesteps what can be done in an environmentally nurturing space that actually
And
advocates for them. Go ahead.
and backing you up, something you said a little bit earlier, we have to be honest that the ideal student is a young white girl.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means for other girls of color and boys, even white boys, right? What does that mean for white boys? And then boys of color. If the ideal student is a white girl, then the fallout from that is the furthest away you are from that ideal student,
Yes.
that's the boys, that's Black boys in particular, the more likely you are to be deemed as having behavioral problems,
Yes.
be a nuisance in class,
Yes. Yes.
and
Yes.
they use prescription drugs to, subdue the young boy. We know this, and I think, well, not even think, Richard Reeves has referred to this very lightly also, right? Very
Mm-hmm.
lightly, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
and we all know what this is, and by the way, the women do too, and that's why I think they're going to attempt to protect their position as any other human being would.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be interesting to see where this conversation goes, particularly over the next decade or so, as these intellectuals attempt to sanitize our message, or at least
Right.
what they, or sanitize what they deem as toxic over here. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. When they fail, I'll just go out on a limb with this one, Dr. T. You don't have to follow me on this one. When they fail, then we can say, yeah, we told you that. And then go
Right.
ahead. I'll pause right there.
No, there needs to be a kind of full-throatedness about this when it comes to advocating for boys and men. We have to be unapologetic about it. We got to be data-based about it. We need to be no nonsense about it. It's not about anyone's feelings. I don't care if people are potentially hurt because we're advocating for boys. I'm a father of a son. I want to see more and more boys being able to advance in their lives. I don't give a damn if that hurts people's feelings. But if her feelings are going to be a priority over boys actually lived quality of life, we have a whole different set of problems. And this is why we need to be unapologetically straightforward rather than appeasing in our tone. But that's just my humble opinion. But let's continue.
Between boys and girls, because boys' brains mature more slowly, then them starting school a year later would mean that they were developmentally closer to being peers with the girls in the classroom. We need a lot more male teachers. It's striking that the teaching profession has become steadily more female over time. Only 24% of K-12 teachers now are male. That's down from 33% in the 80s. And fewer men are applying to teacher training year on year. And so we've seen this steady shift towards a close to an all-female environment.
Right. And the rationale behind that isn't too difficult, aside from the fact that you have, lower numbers of men and black men in particular going to college to get trained in the first place to become teachers. There's still a social expectation that black men and men in general, provide. But how are you going to provide on a salary that people are already, struggling on? I mean, it was just it was an article I just saw. I might even pull it up a little bit later. An article I saw just a few days ago where they're saying teachers are quitting in mass numbers, not only because of the difficulty of the job, but because what you're getting to support yourself in exchange for this difficulty is pennies on the dollar. And so you actually have, people who are being asked to teach in kind of an emergency capacity, right? Who don't have any training in teaching because they're so desperate for teachers. And this is exacerbated by the pandemic, right? So if you're going to actually, if you're going to push for more men to be teachers, the thing nobody wants to say out loud is you got to pay them more. And if you push for men and suggest paying them more, obviously you get into this whole question as to why men get paid more than women. And so it becomes this debate. And if you just put it out there, we're going to pay teachers more, then without any structure that advocates for men directly, you're just going to end up with more teachers, more female teachers that just get paid more. So, anyway.
That has all kinds of consequences for the ethos of the school, for the way we deal with different kinds of behavior among boys and girls, for example. And so we need a very serious and intentional effort to get more men into teaching. The third thing I would do in this world where I have significant power to dictate policies would be significantly more investment in vocational education and training. That is an area where we do seem to see better results for boys and men on average, and one that's woefully underinvested in the US. The US has really bet most of its dollars on a very academic, a very narrow route towards success, and less emphasis on vocational training. And that has actually put boys and men at a disadvantage. So apprenticeships, technical high schools are actually a really good way to help more boys and men. I think one of the challenges with this debate is that if you're talking to women and men who are, say, at the top of the economic ladder, 4-year college degrees, decent incomes, they look around and they don't see some of these issues. But that's not the same for working class men. That's not the same for men lower down the economic ladder. So there's a danger that we're so busy, to borrow Sheryl Sandberg's phrase, so busy leaning in that we don't look down. The reality for men further down the ladder is very different. The economic trends for men have turned downwards along 4 dimensions. One is wages. Most men today earn less than most men did in 1979. In employment, with a drop in labor force participation of 8 percentage points, which means 9 million men now of prime age are not working. We've seen a drop in occupational stature, and so there are now more men working in employment areas which are seen as lower status than they were in the past. And we've also seen a drop in the acquisition of skills, the kinds of skills and education that boys and men need. If boys don't get educated.
Well, and then to add to that, if you come out of a community with no inherited wealth, you're talking about concentrated poverty. But what were you going to say?
No, so this goes to this, and thank you, Dr. Johnson. This goes to the whole zero-sum game.
Right.
The men and the boys don't see the incentive, so they're not doing it. They're not doing it because we've shifted the society, and I would argue allowing women into the workforce more and, higher education more puts us in a very difficult position because the women still want providers. And
Yes.
I think the social engineers, whoever they are, the theys, whoever they are, either don't realize that or think you can socialize that out of them, or they do realize that and they still think you can socialize that out of them, or they
Mm.
don't care because they have a larger goal in mind. Either way, we get to where we are now,
Yeah. Well,
which is, go ahead, I'm sorry.
no, finish your statement.
You tying that to the teachers and their salary, that's a perfect example of what we're saying.
Yeah,
we
absolutely.
we don't pay teachers enough. We want more male teachers, so we say, I actually don't believe that, to tell you the truth. I think they're perfectly comfortable with the way that things are now, with less than what, 10%,
Mhm.
12% of grade school teachers being men.
Mm.
I think we're perfectly okay with that, as a society. But we claim that we're not.
Right.
But for us to attract the men, then first we're going to have to lobby for them to come in, and
Yep.
we're going to have to pay them more. But then, like you said, the women are going to be like, well, why do male teachers get paid more? Or why are we raising the salaries just for the men? And we don't want to really bring them in anyway. So
Right.
it's so many different conflicting things happening at the same time. I think we have a difficult problem addressing because it's going to get really ugly. It's going to make people cringe when we start speaking about why people do the things they do, what people are truly attracted to, people virtue signaling, people's preferences versus revealed preferences. And I'm not just speaking about intimately. I'm saying things that we claim that we prefer in society versus what we actually prefer, what we actually go out and do in our own personal lives. It gets really ugly really fast.
Oh, it does.
I'll pause right there.
And we're also living in an era where we're actually watching women via social media produce content saying things like, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to be independent and strong. I don't want to pay bills by myself. I want a man to pay for them. This is unprecedented. And we're hearing more and more. We've been hearing more of it since the pandemic. But I think one of the other key components to this is when Kevin was alive and would do these interviews on his show, a lot of people would deflect from actually having to deal with what women said on Kevin's show by
Thank you.
by pointing out how much they hated him and he was a misogynist. He's this. But if you listen to the women that would come up every night, what percentage of them, when he would ask them the question, what percentage of the household income do you want to be responsible for? How many of those women said less than 10%? How many of those women said 0%? See, this is the part people don't want to deal with. And this is the kind of gesture that Reeves wants to avoid pointing out. He doesn't want to problematize relationships with women, but by not doing so, by not addressing the elephant in the room, you sidestep a major cultural shift. This push for female independence and advancement has come, but you have women that are jumping ship from this. They are tired of it. They don't want to do it, and we don't have any numbers as to what extent that's going in, but we do know that more and more women are taking issue with this, and nobody wants to talk about it because it's not politically correct, right? So
You know,
we can't talk about it.
Dr. Johnson, so he two interviews that came to mind while you were speaking.
Mhm.
And one of them you can tell. So he mentions black women and how many of them are engaging in same-sex relationships, right? And these people are very, very intelligent. They're very, very knowledgeable. Also, they know what's going on. And he says it, and you can tell he knows that they're engaging in this because it's like, well, we can't have the men that we want, so I guess we'll just do this thing over here, right?
Mm.
It's that, and then something else he said on another interview,
You talking
which
about
is
conditional lesbianism? Is that
it
true?
pretty much, and I think that we have to actually start calling that for what it is. And I
Right.
actually think that, as a matter of fact, I'm going to start exactly what it is. It is conditional lesbianism, and I think that we need to say that and call it for what it is. Number one, and not in a negative way, but just it is.
It is
That's
what it
what it
is.
is, right?
Yeah.
And then on another interview, he speaks about this as if there's a way to socialize this out of women. And for his sake, and for America's sake, and for Western society's sake, I hope so. Because what we're running into the wall of, and as you were saying, is the women that are clearly yelling from the top of their lungs. I still want a man or men to choose from that are on my level at the absolute lowest or above me educationally, economically. And that is why you see a particular class of women
Yes.
still having children within wedlock, still getting married. And once you dip down under that top 20%, the divorce rate skyrockets, the marriage rates plummet. And what we're finding, a news anchor actually covered this. I've been racking my brain for not saving it, but and it was a woman, mind you, who was speaking about, for the first time ever, what is being shown is that it's not just the actual outcome, even the hope. So people lower down on the socioeconomic scale actually don't want to have families even more than those at the top, and they don't want to have children. They don't want to get married. So we have reached a point where it's not just what you're able to do. Now we're reaching the point where you don't even want to try. You don't aspire for those things, right? Because quite frankly, if we live in this capitalist society, people are realizing more and more, do I really want to bring a child into this world that might be hampered in this way because of my socioeconomic position? And that's a frightening thought. And I think Richard Reeves addresses it just a smidge, but to me, not enough. And I'll pause right there.
Let's hear what else he has to say on it.
And men don't get skilled, they will struggle in the labor market. And across all of those domains, we've seen a downwards turn for men in the last 4 or 5 decades. And so the way in which social class divides have opened up, economic inequality has widened, is really important to understand in the context of gender inequality. If we only focus on gender gaps, then we miss the fact that both men and women at the top have done increasingly well. But that's much less true of everybody else, and especially it's less true of those from lower income backgrounds, working class boys and men, and black boys and men. You see many of those trends are amplified, and so those boys and men are really at the sharpest end of many of the social and economic changes.
Well, and I credit him with that because he and Raj Chetty are willing to say what black men have been trying to say but haven't been heard about, and that is that black men and boys tend to be at the most vulnerable end of this. And and within the black community, you're not allowed to say that because we presuppose from the logic of intersectionality that women have it worse simply because, again, they exist and all forces are against them because they're women. But when you look at the data, that doesn't seem to be the case. And we actually find that men are actually hyper vulnerable on the basis of being men. This is an interesting twist, right? The initial argument with intersectionality was that black men were privileged because they were male. And that was the only difference between black men and women. Black women were oppressed in terms of race, class, sex, gender, and a number of different qualifiers that came later. And that black men were too, except that they were privileged because they were male. And this was an assumption. This was something that was argued, but it wasn't rooted in very much data, right? It wasn't rooted in anything substantive. But when we actually find that there's actually data that illustrates quite easily that black men are actually hyper vulnerable because they're male, it upends what we assume to be true. And instead of confronting that reality, what they did is they kind of swept it under the rug, right? And they began to popularize and mainstream intersectionality to a point where white women got hold of it. And now black women can't even claim intersectionality anymore. White women have owned it. They've taken this term, and now its meaning is all over the place. It damn near almost doesn't mean anything at this point. But at the end of the day, black males in either context, whether it was when black women were holding the discussion on intersectionality or white women, black males have been eliminated from the conversation. So to hear Reeves, Raj Chetty, and of course, scholars that have already been doing this, like my boy, Dr. Neil in the comment section, shout out to you, Green Gorilla, myself, Dr. Tommy Curry, when these brothers we've been saying this shit for years. People didn't hear it until, Reeves and Chetty said it. And now the fight is, how seriously are we going to take it? Or are we going to do anything about it? That's the fight at this point.
Dr. T. So, Richard Reeves wrote another book called Dream Hoarders, and it hyper focused not on the top 1%, but that 19% under them, right? So really the top 20%, and how they don't. It's not only the money, it's the opportunities, it's the education. And that's why it's called Dream Hoarders. These people are hoarding their position. So this is why we see a break between the one and that other 19, and then a growing chasm between the
Absolutely.
top 20% and that bottom 80.
Yes.
And so, if we know that, and yet we're putting more and more women on the fast track to be part of that top 20%, and more men are falling off, particularly Black boys and men. And the studies that we've seen where Black boys and men that are born to upper middle class families, 70% of them come back down to working class. If that's the if that And by the way, that was also published by Brookings Institute, if I'm not mistaken. If that's the case, then we will continue to see this, and it's only going to get worse as time goes on. It's going to get exponentially worse because we refuse to address this, and even when we do it lightheartedly and kind of on the margins, right? Instead of being full throated, like you're saying, because we don't want to hurt feelings. And I think there's something to be said about having theory and what that theory looks like when it's put into practice. And I think we're running into the wall of thinking that you can socialize certain behaviors and certain things that people want, right, out of them. And I hope so, like I said, for society's sake, but that remains to be seen. And I'll pause right there.
Okay, let's continue.
On the one hand, we have a huge and successful and laudable effort to get more women into STEM jobs, so science, technology, engineering, and math. On the other side, we have what I call HEAL jobs. So that's health, education, administration, and literacy, almost, if you like, the opposite side of the coin to STEM jobs. And that's where a lot of the jobs are coming from. Health and education alone are huge and growing sectors in the US. And so, by my estimates, for every one job we're going to create in STEM between now and 2030, we're going to create 3 in HEAL jobs. But those jobs are at least as gender segregated as STEM jobs, but in the other direction. And unlike STEM, becoming more so over time. So if you look at the HEAL sector, only 24% of the workers in those sectors are male, and that number is falling.
Yes.
And in particular sectors, we're seeing a really precipitous drop in the number of men. We have a drop in the number of male teachers. We have a very sharp drop in the number of male psychologists. That's dropped from 39% male to 29% male in the last decade alone. And among psychologists under the age of 30, only 5% are male. So we roll that forward, and we're going to see psychology becoming essentially almost an all-female profession.
See, and that's why there's been several different misandric counselors and therapists we've seen over the last few years, because they're coming into a space where not only is the curriculum framed around the Duluth model, but there's not even any pushback on an experiential level in terms of having men in the class or men teaching the class. So here you just have this echo chamber where you have women teaching women, and they're reflecting on their experiences and their feelings and their perceptions, and that perception becomes somehow true, but there's no pushback from men. And so the very field, just like in education, ends up becoming, deferring to this femininity that we're not supposed to speak aloud, right? So this is the dynamic that's taking place. Now, what the other danger, and this relates to something he was saying a couple seconds ago, as far as men falling out of the job market, what men are starting to discover, and I think the pandemic really exacerbated this, men are starting to discover that, one, to survive on their own, they actually don't need much. If you need to take care of a woman, if you need to take care of a family, you need to grind your ass off. But if you're just taking care of yourself, I think what a lot of men have started to discover is you don't require a lot. And that began to really change the game. And again, the pandemic forced everybody to stay at home far more than they would in any other context. Of course, you had essential workers that had to do what they had to do regardless. But for many men that had to stay home, and then on top of that, and this is something BGS and I joke about, many men also discovered that they weren't going to have a heart attack if they didn't have access to sex. If anything, what they found is there was far less stress that you no longer had to deal with in terms of arguments, drama, back and forth. If you're sitting in there, whether it's, and I don't criminalize or talk down about whatever men enjoy. I don't care look at me. I'm one of the biggest nerds you're gonna find. I don't, you know. So if you like video games, you like comic books, whatever it is, I think a lot of men figured out that it's cheaper, that I can actually go do these things that I enjoy, live a fairly peaceful life. I don't have to become CEO of a company, and if I choose to, that's great. Shout out to all the brothers that want to do that. But for cats that actually just kind of found that they enjoyed life without the stress, this is going to be something that's going to be hard to recondition men back into. The sacrifice for family. And again, family court has a lot to do with the disincentivizing of men going into marriage, because they really get nothing out of it. When she decides to pull that lever and divorce your ass, there's really nothing keeping her from it. You basically, marrying a woman in the West is like taking a pin out of a grenade and carrying it around and just hoping that it doesn't go off. And I hate to put it that way, because I was married and I grew up wanting marriage and children, but the way it's been weaponized at this point, you really have to find a woman that just isn't going to pull that lever. And you, for 20, 30, 40 years, all you can do is hope she doesn't. And so I think for a lot of men who don't have a guarantee that she won't, you know, especially when we're looking at even these kind of marital agreements, what do you call them?
Prenups?
Yeah, prenups. When you see those falling through in court, you reach a point where it's like, well, okay, so I can, you know, I can run this risk with this grenade, or I can chill, and I don't require much, you know. And I think that's going to be one of the things, again, exacerbated by the pandemic. That's one of the things that they're going to have a difficult time conditioning men back into, when men have actually found that they can live without certain things. Now, I'm not saying all men are or any of that bullshit, but there are a lot of men that discovered that they didn't need the stress and they actually would be okay without it. Shout out to Dr. Neil. Richard Reeves is getting traction because the white ruling class is slowly recognizing that men's issues matter. Eventually, feminist opportunists will attempt to colonize these issues. No doubt.
Exactly.
No doubt.
You know, Dr. T, when you were speaking, so what came to mind was something I've been recently saying, which is, well, have fun trying to incentivize the boys and the men, right? So this is as a summation of what you're saying. What is the incentive to get men really not just back in the workforce, because men are still working, but less so, but with that certain zeal, with that certain
Yes.
fight?
Yes.
What in society? Because okay, you're going to tell them, okay, you're going to live a precarious life, and your wife can divorce you at any time and
Yes.
take the kids,
Yes.
and there's not a fast track, or there's not a really prescribed way for upward mobility anymore. It's kind of tic-tac-toe if you're not in STEM, right? So all of these things that are not necessarily guarantees, and then the chasm growing between um, upper class people, the top 20%, and then everyone else. And even Richard Reeves himself, being someone of British descent, spoke about how it's more likely for you to move up in classes in Britain than even in America, right? So, which the whole thing in America is the American dream. So, once again, the question then becomes, how do you incentivize the boys and the young men to be these kick-ass people?
Right.
What's the incentive if you already taken women and children off the table for the most part, if they're not part of that top 20%?
Absolutely.
You know,
That's going to be one of the biggest issues on the table, and people haven't figured out quite how to deal with it yet. Matter of fact, I'll tell you the one way so far that I've seen it being dealt with is shaming. I was just watching the We Need to Talk channel with Alan Obi. Shout out to Alan. He had an interesting show earlier today where he was interviewing a married man, and the video starts with him talking about the things he saw his mother do to a stepfather that took him on as a son. Him and his brother took him on as a son, and raised him as his own son and his brother, right? And then he said, and there's a lot to it, you really should listen to the video. It's a very powerful interview. But he eventually talks about his mother pulling what I call that lever. She pulled the divorce lever. It sent him into a tailspin. She didn't have to work for years. She was taking vacations off of money And this guy was sending up to $80,000 in 1 year in child support.
Ooh.
And 2 of those kids weren't even his. They had a daughter together, but at least 3 kids where 2 of them weren't his biologically, and he's paying out the nose. And so he said he finally sat down with his stepfather and he's found out all the things that had gone on and so on and so forth. A very powerful interview. But later in the interview, this is again a married man. When he starts talking about marriage and he starts talking about single men who don't want to get married, he frames it in this way where you avoid it because you're weak. See, these are the kind of shaming tactics we're hearing. Men are avoiding marriage and relationships out of weakness and fear, when in actuality, much of it is just strategic. It's cold logic. You look at this mathematically and you say, well, the benefits to this, I mean, really the main benefits that come out of this are children. If you want to have a legacy that goes beyond yourself, that's the benefit. But the cost is ridiculous. So when you factor in something like Passport Bros, the cost now drops dramatically.
So in other words, Dr. Johnson, young men are being shamed for not wanting to go to Vegas and go gamble and knowing that the house is going to win 70 or 80% of the time.
Exactly.
Right? How dare you not want to go gamble? Especially for those in the bottom 80% of income earners, right? How dare you not gamble knowing that somewhere between 70 to 80% you're going to lose eventually, right? This is not going to go all the way to one of you passing. That, as a person who is in a relationship and that is definitely considering marriage, I would not propose this to anyone that's not willing to take that gamble and know for sure,
right,
that you're most likely not going to make it on the other side. Right?
That's a cold kind of situation to come to grips with.
It's expensive. God is expensive.
It's expensive.
I'm not even married yet.
And you have to look at your own child and tell him or her, or especially him, this is a dangerous endeavor. But now you have men that are finding, a cheaper alternative, going another route. And, this is the reality of where we are, but nobody wants to admit that. So what they do, again, another shaming tactic, they make Passport Bros out to be these pedophilic men that go overseas purely for sex. And if they can have sex with children, great. That's what they do. Because all of that differs from actually seeing mature, well-earning, middle to upper middle class men who've made a decision, a rational, calm, calculated decision to get what they want out of life in terms of family and children, and not have to worry that this woman, they just handed her over their entire well-being in hopes that she doesn't pull this lever and send them to go live in their mother's garage. I mean, this is the reality. And they don't want to do it. And part of the problem is the only men that can really afford to travel like this are the men that, at least financially or on paper, these women across race in America are saying they want. It is what it is. Those are the only men that can really afford to do it. But I am finding, and I'll just be brief with this because I want to get back to Reeves, there are men across class that are finding their own way to engage in Passport Bro culture, or at least outlook. You're talking about people that are dealing with interracial relationships. They're dealing with international relationships within the boundaries of the U.S. So you're talking about people who are from other countries in the U.S., maybe even second generation. You know what I mean? There are all kind of variations that I'm seeing everyday men make that don't necessarily involve getting on a plane and going to another country, but it's still in the same spirit of trying to find a better deal for what they want out of life. And it's taken all kinds of different twists and turns, and these are guys that many of whom have never even heard of a manosphere, but the environment is pushing people to make these decisions because the cost is just too great.
This is the second order effects that Reeves speaks about. I don't know how you mitigate against this outside of what we're proposing. Because to be frank, if we are going to, if marriage is reverting back to an institution for the elite, then the fallout of that with a society that was built off of, single woman, single man getting married, having nuclear families, if we're going to revert back to something a little different where it's the elite that get married and most importantly stay married, then the fallout of that is going to be men taking their ball and going home. And that looks like what you describe as passport bros. That looks like SYSBM. That looks like a number of things.
Yeah.
And, so be it.
Well, and it gets worse when you start seeing more and more celebrities with the George Clooney method, or at least up until when he got married, right? Who are avoiding marriage or who are having these devastating divorces. Now, look, if you're worth 400 million and you lose 200 million to your wife in a divorce, that's frustrating. But people have this way of talking about, this is only something that affects the rich. No, it doesn't. If you make 20,000 a year and you got 3 kids, even if 2 of them ain't even yours, and you got to go to divorce court, you gonna tell me that 10,000 doesn't mean anything? I mean, you got $1 million and you got to give somebody 500,000. That might be irritating. If you got $10 and you got to give somebody 5, that's a problem. Especially if that 5 is all you have to live on. So I don't know where we get this argument that poor people or working class people shouldn't have to worry about divorce because that's a rich. No, you might have to be that much more concerned about it, because I'm gonna tell you, anybody with 400 million that has to lose 2, they're not worried about where they sleep in the night. They're not worried about dinner. They're irritated at something that feels bad and looks bad. You got to worry about where your next meal is coming from. And Chris Rock said it best: I should not have to move back in with my mama because you ain't happy.
Well, and that is why I would argue, you for the better part of the past 60 years, you saw more and more, particularly Black men, get married less, engaged in marriage less, because it was, maybe they didn't know how to vocalize it as much, but now that we have the words for it, but it's exactly for what you described. It is, why am I engaging in this when the odds are so stacked against me, right? And so,
Well, Black men started doing that in the mid 1960s. They really did. The numbers started to drop then. We've always been the canaries in the mine. They started to withdraw. I've actually called it a silent protest. We didn't have a platform, especially in the 60s or 70s. We didn't really have a framework. We didn't even have a vocabulary, but we knew there was a changing climate. And when I sit down and talk to my fathers, my uncles, my godfathers, the men of that generation, they were just in it. Like right now, we're not seeing our situation as clearly as the way we'll see it 50 years from now. You're just in the mix. You're never going to see it as clearly. Hindsight is always 20/20. But those men dealt with what they could on the ground, and it was only years later that they could actually see it for what it was. So that's what a lot of us are dealing with. But I've argued at that time they engaged in what I call a silent protest, and they marched and they voted with their feet, as it were, and they just began to slowly withdraw. And a lot of that has to do with policy around birth control, around marriage, around divorce, around, alimony, child support, family court. All of these things began to bear on men. But again, when you're poor, you have no inherited wealth, and you have limited income, these issues have a devastating impact, or can, more so than somebody who's wealthy. Because you see with rich white men, especially up through from the 80s onward to the early 2000s, you see these cats, they would have 3 wives. They would have 3 marriages, 2 and 3 marriages, different groups of kids. And they were upset that the wives were turning the kids against them. And, it was starting to bother them that they were paying alimony and child support. But when you have, virtually nothing, you mess around and have 2 wives and 2 sets of kids, and all of them are hitting you in family court. Whole different equation. But let me go back to Reeves. Here we go.
So these jobs, which are both crucial, I think, for society, and where it'd be very useful to have more diversity, are actually becoming more gender segregated. And so we have absolutely no effort to get more men into heel jobs, which is where I think the future lies and where we should be helping men to move. One of the problems that we face is what I call in the book a dad deficit. And that can be seen in various different ways. So 1 in 4 fathers don't live with their children. If parents split up, they're much more likely to lose contact with their fathers and with their mothers. And so 1 in 3 children, if their parents split up, don't see their father at all after a few years post the separation. So this fatherlessness is something that's very, very specific. And when 4 in 10 children are born outside marriage, and most children to less educated parents are born outside marriage, then we have to reinvent what it means to be a father. Because right now, men are still being held to an old standard of what it meant to be a successful father in a world where that is neither possible for many of them or even desirable. Because what we've seen is, as women have grown in economic power and economic independence, then of course they're going to choose to be with a man rather than being forced to, as in the old days. This is probably the greatest liberation in human history, honestly, that women can now choose whether to be with a man or not. More than 2 out of 5 households in the US now, a woman is the main breadwinner. 40% of American women earn more than the average man. These are huge economic changes and all for the good. But it does pose some really sharp questions about what fathers are for. And until we escape the obsolete model of the breadwinner father, then we will continue to see more and more men being left out of family life.
Now, this is a problem unto itself for me. Again, he comes with the celebratory tone in regard to this, but what he overlooks just right off the bat is how many women still want the provider model.
Thank you. Thank you.
This is just a backward belief that these men have. The reason the men, especially the men on YouTube, the reason the men talk about provider status so much is because that's what we run into in the dating pool. Women are assessing you for provider status from day one. And this includes women that are earning high level salaries because, and many of us have heard it. I know I've heard it. She will tell you, my money is my money. Your money is my money, or at least our money. None of her money is your money. You don't have access to that. The expectation, the social expectation on men is still provider. So I disagree with this framing of provider as something these, misogynist males are just caught up with and they're trying to relive the 50s. No, women are requiring these males that demonstrate the capacity to provide. But here's the twist. In the 50s, you got a woman who worked with you, and she understood that her well-being was tied to how well you did. This is why you had so many women that opposed the rise of the feminist movement, especially rich white women, because they saw it as greater competition for their husbands in the workplace, advocating for their own well-being. When you turn it into, she can be independent, she can do what she wants, she can have a child, she can put it up for divorce, for
abortion,
and she can have an abortion.
Adoption and abortion.
She can do whatever she wants with her role in the family. You, as a man, are still stuck in the 1950s. See, now we've gotten to this cherry picking dynamic where it's not an old model versus a new model. It's an old model that's still an old model, except that the woman doesn't have to work with you for her interests. She does whatever she wants to and still relies on you. And if she's unhappy or if you failed her expectations, she can pull the lever and still exact what she wants out of you, whether you want to give it or not. That is not a viable model. And so his framing of the current family dynamic is problematic because it blames men for holding on to an old idea. And it suggests that men just can't keep up with this new independent woman. First of all, the new independent woman can't keep up with the new independent woman.
Yeah.
And this is why she frames her newness on the basis of she's this special snowflake that can do whatever she wants. But what she's standing on is still a foundation that requires men still function like it's the 1950s. And that's what he's being disingenuous about here. He's misframing this as something men are holding on to, when men are actually responding to the expectation and saying, okay, if I want children, if I want a wife, if I want to have a family, and I don't want to be raised in the same dynamic I grew up in, I don't want to have kids in that dynamic. I want to actually have a nuclear family. And these women are requiring that I be a provider. That's the discussion you're hearing amongst men, how to be a better provider, how to make more money, what you need to do, so on and so forth. That's where that comes from. It's not a bunch of men holding on to an old idea because they're stuck in Leave It to Beaver episodes. That's not what it is.
Dr. Johnson, so you mentioned Kevin, and rest in peace, Kevin Samuels. So this is one of the things that made his channel so big, is that we got to see that. So it is not just Kevin, it's a number of men that were interviewing women, speaking to women, all at the same time.
Mhm.
Different women, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different parts of the country, different looks, different body sizes, different ages. And one theme that constantly came up is exactly what you said. It's, I want a man like this. And it
Yes.
was always the top 20% man.
Yes.
So no, men aren't making this up. It's not a certain type of woman,
No.
it's women.
Yeah.
And what we've done over the better part of the past 60 or so years
Mhm.
is give women high heels to stand over the men while
Yes.
they want men still taller than them.
Oh,
and
oh,
and that has
oh.
so many social, political, and economic ramifications. Like Richard
Yeah.
Reeve said, the second order effects to that, it, it it's something that I don't know if we could recover from, at least in the short term, right? Because this is what the women want, right?
Yes.
This is what they're saying they want. It's not men who are saying, no, I'm gonna be this guy no matter what. I would
Right.
argue, and I've made this argument to a content creator I had a conversation with. I would argue that we have socialized the men to be far more egalitarian than
Yes.
we've socialized the women to. The
Absolutely.
men are far more willing to, and particularly if you live in major cities, if you're working anywhere outside of maybe construction or very, very heavily male dominated spaces, you are
Mhm.
socialized to have female bosses. You are socialized to take instruction from women. You are not afraid of women of authority.
Mhm.
Any of that, all of those things, for the better part of the past 40, 50 years, we've done a pretty good job at socializing the men um,
Well,
and
you
being
know what?
okay with. Mhm.
Let me respond to that because you're dead on,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
This is something I always found interesting, especially with black men, right? We're raised in a
yeah,
community with more female heads of households than any other. You know, if you want to talk about a group of men that are acculturated to female leadership, you are
hmm
actually talking about black men. Black men are not threatened by women in leadership. We grew up in it. I mean,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
this, look, if you look at the age range, from through preschool, before kindergarten, right, before you start school, you're used to a female head of household, and then you go to school where you have predominantly female teachers, and that can go from kindergarten through graduate school,
yeah, yeah,
majority of
yeah,
female. This characterization of men as these sexist, misogynist, group of human beings that can't handle female leadership. That's all most of us have ever known. The
yeah,
problem comes into play when you try to assert your skill or knowledge and actually get pushback simply on the basis that you're male. See, we
yeah,
can't talk about misandry because it's not supposed to exist.
yeah,
Only misogyny exists, right? And this is what Reeves is up against. He's trying to push back against this idea that misandry is not a thing. It's just the
yeah,
way he pushes back is different than I do. I call misandry, and I call
yeah,
anti-black misandry just that because it's very
yeah,
specific. It's very and it's different from what other groups go through. You go back to lynching, for example. That's something unique to heterosexual black men. That's not something
yeah,
everybody just got on a regular basis. But
yeah,
back to my point, Reeves is pushing back against this by not pointing out that misandry exists, but simply saying this is how men are suffering. You
yeah.
know, women have it bad too, but can we talk about men? It's this I think it was is it Les Miserables, this begging,
Yeah, Les Miserables.
can please, sir, can I have more? This kind of
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
the accent and everything. I don't think it'll work. But at the end of the day, if if you have boys and men that are able to advance on that, great. Personally though, I think it's more important that we call shit out the way it is because that's not something we've ever done. And I've argued this for years now when I say we've talked about in the black community, especially, we've talked about race, class, sex, gender. We've had conversations for decades. There are whole movements
hmm
behind all of this. What we don't talk about is the way in which the family and women in particular have been weaponized against black men. And I say it that way purposefully. I mean, because the reason I say that is because the institutions that are operationalized in her interest, whether it's whimsical or purposeful, she can employ these institutions at her whim against a male. Men can't do that. This is why I frame it the way I do. I am talking about women who are taking this capacity to weaponize the family against men and using it willy-nilly. I talk about it that way because they are doing it, and they've been able to do it, and they're enabled by institutions that allow it. Men don't have the same power. That's why I talk about it as a one-way dynamic. You can't call and say this woman just hit me in the face and she goes to jail. I mean, she might get a night at best, but at the end of the day, it's not going to have the same momentum it would have when she calls and says you laid hands on her. Police will show up and you're bloody and you will still go to jail. Right? This is the dynamic we live in. And we could talk about the educational system. We could talk about employment. We know the way Black men are perceived. You're going to be less sought after with a college degree than a white male with a high school diploma or with a jail record. These are dynamics that women don't experience in the same way. So I talk about it this way, not because I'm angry at women, but because I'm recognizing a dynamic that we don't know how to talk about full-throatedly in public. Right, this was my problem. I listened to the interview, or at least a portion of it, that you did with FD, and it's really kind of this kind of mealy mouth, tap danced around. It's not even as full throated as Reeves, but it's still a practice that we as Black men have mastered in terms of catering to women's ego, but not being willing to say up front, this is what the problem is. This is a dynamic we need to talk about.
Something, Dr. T, that I attempted to stress to FD. I wasn't gonna say his name until you said it. So okay, now you gave me the green light.
I was waiting. He said he wanted to talk to me. I was waiting. So anyway,
but something that I tried to stress to him is we have to be honest about the fact that there are educated, elite, and connected Black women who are being fueled by whatever true animosity. With whatever childhood trauma, youthful rejection, youthful whatever, and because these new years of feminism, and because these tools are on the table, they use them under the guise of feminism and using a feminist lens to view Black men through. And quite frankly, they are using a very radical and sexist feminist lens to view Black men through. And I think we also have to take into account the class element. We are speaking about women who actually may not need men economically, but their prescriptions and their answers to everyday women is as if these other women are them. So there is another content creator online. She was a Harvard attendee. She didn't graduate, but she was speaking about someone, and she said, we need to bring back, we don't need these Negroes feminism, and Negroes is not the word she used. And that quote right there said everything. So this young lady, from my understanding, is making some $300,000 a year. She can say that, right? And I'm tying all of this to what we're talking about. She can say we need to bring back, we don't need these Negroes feminism. But the young lady listening to her that's only earning $30,000 a year, $25,000 a year, $20,000 a year, maybe even 40 grand, she can't say that. Now she will, she'll try to live that life, and the consequences of that, the content creator that said that, she'll never have to live with the consequences of putting that type of rhetoric out there. And so my response to Dr. Reeves is, we have to be honest that we haven't done a very good job at investigating why certain people, namely the feminists, have this particular worldview and what that means for everyday women. Everyday women are earning some less than 30 grand a year. And, at most, I think the average was some like 34,000 or something. And that was like 40-hour work week, like almost a perfect condition type situation, right? And we have to be honest that elite educated women have theories that they're allowing to seep out in society, and then everyday women and men have to deal with the consequences of academia's theories.
But let's look at, in the analogy you raised, how it bleeds out. Now, first and foremost, the $30,000-$40,000 earner who's listening to the music of the day, who's watching the films of the day, who's listening to the rhetoric of this $300,000 earning woman, they are internalizing this misandry, and they're teaching it to their sons and daughters. They're empowering, quote unquote, their daughters with this misandry, and in many ways, they are mistreating their sons with this misandry, right? That's one end of the spectrum. Let's take the $300,000 earner. One of the things I was saying during in 2020, when the pandemic started, we started to see all of these programs, right? We started to see programs in different cities around the country around, designating single mothers, particularly Black single mothers, as, recipients of city and state support, right? We started to see this. Then we started to see programs and grants for mom and pop Black businesses, right? But overwhelmingly female. Then we started to see the Goldman Sachs's and the $10 billion, earmark just for Black women to advance in the market in the next 10 years. Google, MasterCard, Visa. We started to see all of these corporations. But here's the thing that people missed. These corporations didn't just wake up and decide they cared about Black women. What it was is you had those $300,000 earners who had college degrees, who had jobs at Goldman Sachs. They had jobs at Visa. They had jobs at MasterCard. And they were bringing in this slanted feminist data into these corporations. These are not halls of learning. These are corporations predicated on profit. They said, look, this is the feminist data we pulled out, which is very, cherry picked, that suggests that women are victims. And if you tap into this victim pool who happen to spend a lot of money when they consume media, those two things line up really well. This is how you urge a lot of these corporations to start prioritizing women. It took women, feminists within these corporations, to operationalize skewed data that they learned in college and prioritize and foregrounding women and girls only. So even within the Black community, a community with a history of struggle, they're not advocating for Black community. They're advocating for Black women and girls only. So that $300,000 earner is pushing policy through corporate philanthropic measures to make sure that what the corporation then extends to the public is only earmarked for women and girls.
Dr. T, on top of that, for Goldman Sachs specifically, so I covered this on my channel also, where Goldman Sachs was getting caught up in a whole lot of fraud overseas, right? And for the first time in their history, they were the U.S. Supreme Court really was like, okay, no, we have let you get away with too much for over a century. We finally are gonna hit you. This time we're gonna catch you. And so around this time is when Goldman Sachs proposes that $10 billion for Black women. So what you're seeing is corporations looking for it, because we live in this kind of society where the corporations and the banks and the companies are being pushed to get into kind of social work, which I'm at best I'm iffy about, and we I have my whole theories on that. But so now they get to hide their crimes, right? Both domestic and international crimes behind being philanthropic behind Black women. So you use intersectionality in particular, right? Black and women, you use that to hide all of your crimes behind, and it also puts Black women in the position to now defend you, right? And so who's going to tell Black women, right, especially outside of Black men, who's going to tell Black women that they are now they're going to be positioned as the mascot for Dr. Evil Corporation, right? Dr. Evil Incorporated, and it's actually genius on their part, to be honest, and I'll pause right there.
And I'll tell you this, even if Goldman and other corporate, if they don't follow through, the damage in some respects in terms of public appearance has already been done. The appearances as far as the public is concerned, it's already been done. If they don't follow through, it is what it is. I mean, one thing I'll say about the public is their memory is short. So there's a $10 billion promise put on the table. If in 10 years from now that promise was dissolved and the conversation is shifted to something else, I don't think Goldman Sachs is going to lose much sleep about it, but we'll see what happens. But let me go back to Reeves and we'll see if we can get to the end of this.
And the kicker is that boys in families that don't have a father presence suffer much more than girls. And so then what happens is that male disadvantage can become intergenerational, because if the fathers are struggling and therefore not really involved in their kids' lives, then the boys are the ones who suffer most, who will then go on to struggle themselves in education and the labor market.
Now see, just real quick, see how he shifted from women blew past boys to boys suffer more? without fathers. You see, that's the bait and switch. And I'm not mad at it. I'm just pointing out that's how they're rolling with this. That's how they're trying to avoid offending people. He'll say what gets people comfortable, and then give them a couple minutes, and then he'll say something like, boys are much more negatively affected than girls. Anyway. Oh crap, not again. Shit.
Would it went down, Dr. T?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you well.
All right. Yeah, my screen went completely black, but it opened up again. So let's see. It's I don't know.
Well, Dr. T, in about 10-ish minutes, I'm gonna jump in this loud car. So you may not be able to hear me. I'm gonna be able to hear you. So for like 25 minutes, I may not be saying that much. So just giving you a heads up.
Thank you for that. I'm just going to get to the end of this video and we can close it out.
A number of people warned
Let me see.
very academic of a father present and a sense of purpose matter to men. And so as we've seen these real challenges faced by men in education, work, and the family, you're seeing some really difficult and troubling health consequences. And so the so-called deaths of despair from suicide, overdose, or alcohol, 3 times higher among men than among women. Suicide itself, 3 times higher among men and women, and rising very quickly, especially among middle-aged men and younger men. So we can see these as symptoms, I think, of a broader malaise, which is what's troubling boys and men. And for men in particular, this sense of purpose is very important. I think it's a human universal that we need to be needed. There's a wonderful piece of work by an academic called Fiona Shand who looked at the last words that men had used to describe themselves before committing suicide or attempting suicide. And the top of the list were worthless and useless. I think if we create a society in which so many men do feel like they're not needed, then it's no surprise that we see these deaths of despair, we see problems with opioids. Opioids are a much bigger problem for men than they are for women. And one of the great tragedies of opioid deaths is the death rates are higher in part because the users are on their own. And so in some ways, the opioid epidemic is a perfect illustration of a whole series of things we're talking about, which is a loss of role in the family, a loss of status in the labor market, turning to drugs, and being isolated and withdrawn. And so in that example, I think you can see a symptom of this broader male malaise that we just need to take it more seriously, and we have a cultural responsibility as a society.
That's the logic. We just need to take it more seriously. But notice how he slipped this in. He slipped in that the opioid epidemic has far greater impact on men than women. Suicide, far greater impact on men than women. These are things that you couldn't say 6 months ago without being severely attacked. And I'm telling you that from experience, right? You couldn't say it. He's able to say it, but the only way he's able to say it is to start out with a celebratory tone about women's inherent, incredible, superpoweredness, and how they're able to, kind of blow past all expectations. Oh, but by the way, drugs and suicide impact men more. See, that's the way that rolls. There you go. He's almost done.
Society, men and women together, to help men and boys to adjust to this new world. Because right now, many of them are really struggling.
Get smarter, faster with
okay. So that's how he frames it. So the men are struggling. And I agree. He just comes at it from a different way. And I think overall, the cost of sidestepping what needs to be said outright will come at the end. I think the bill will come due, as I said earlier, one way or the other. But if this is how he gets the agenda on the table and we start to see some policy out of it, I'll wait to see. Hey, if it produces change for men and boys, then I'm happy for it. It's just a difference in approach and style, and I'm seeing more of this because I think many men. Here's the thing: I think when feminism really began to take on a very aggressive tone in the late '60s, I don't think men across race knew how to deal with it. Men did not know how to fight women, especially in situations where what was taking place was unjust. Men didn't really know how, because any type of fight they responded with, they looked like the enemy. If they didn't respond at all, they were vulnerable and they kept getting hit. Men did not know how to respond. So I think what we're seeing are a myriad of ways that men are finally figuring out how to respond. And some ways are, I like, some I don't. It doesn't have not much to do with me. But the point is, there are a variety of different methods being used. And so I'm saying I'm not thrilled about this particular approach, but at the end of the day, I look at it as a chessboard. Each piece has a different set of rules. And this approach that we're seeing coming from the left, coming from what I'm calling this new politically correct attempt at a manosphere, they might be able to move in circles that some of us won't. I don't think it's necessarily a plus. I think it is what it is. And if it's of use, great. I toe the line with preparing men to be able to speak, because I think that's more crucial in the long run. But I'm gonna give my colleague Mr. Z a chance to close out. I know he's driving. Any closing thoughts?
Wow, colleague. Oh man, I'm honored. But Dr. T.
By the way, go to Mr. Z's channel, subscribe if you haven't already. Watch his shows, check him out, support the brother. He's doing good work. But go ahead. What were you gonna say?
Thank you, Dr. T. So I understand where Richard Reeves is coming from. I think if that's the lane that he wants to occupy by kind of sanitizing some of this, what is deemed as toxic, and bring it to the forefront and have that conversation with the feminists, with whoever the theys are, right? The social designers, the planners, the technocrats, whoever the theys are, right? I don't see anything wrong with that on its face. Do I think that works out in the long run? Probably not. I think there is a certain level of naivete, or at least he's a really good actor in pretending like he may not fully appreciate the fact that for these people it is a zero-sum game, and your attempts at garnering sympathy for boys and men, these people don't care about. Even some mothers of sons, because if they're far enough up, then their sons are kind of not immune, but somewhat shielded from the fallout of that bottom 80. That's why I continue to stress the class element, right? Those top 20% women who are married to those top 20% men, especially not black, they're like, well, I'm good. My son is going to be okay, so he's not going to feel the fallout of what you're speaking about.
There is that, but real quick, let me say, I've also seen women who have no daughters, right? They have sons, and those sons are literally sleeping in the damn park, homeless. And these women are setting up black girl magic programs for other women's daughters. So there is a kind of bubble that I think many feminists and black women in particular have been socialized to operate in, where they are oblivious to even the men and boys in their own lives, and primarily will fixate on advocating for other girls and women, even when they don't have daughters themselves. It's a compulsion, I think, that's been really conditioned into them to prioritize only. And that's why I said earlier, when we talked about Goldman Sachs, these women are getting into position, but they're not advocating for and these women have sons. They're not setting up programs for their sons. They're not setting up educational programs at school using the finances from their job. They're not doing that. They're setting it up only for girls. Hell, many of these women are setting up businesses only to sell to other black women. I'm telling you, the deep psychosis. Well, go ahead.
And to speak to that, before I close out, and so something that I'm losing my train of thought a little bit. No, it's okay. Something that was said earlier, if I can remember, don't miss it. It's just I don't think that Richard Reeves necessarily misses the mark all the way. I agree with you that he's being very careful and deliberate and intentional on the steps that he makes to mitigate and kind of thwart what he knows is going to be the pushback, right? And I understand that, but I still think that we end up in a very dangerous place for society, to be frank, in the next decade or so, because I don't think that he will get the true answer from these people, which is like, no, it's rigged in our favor, and we want it to be rigged in our favor. I think there's like I was saying earlier, I think if it's not naivete, it's definitely looking like that. And I get it. I definitely understand where Dr. Reeves is coming from. Like I said, I've binge watched so much of his interviews. even before this book, Dream Hoarders. And I think as a researcher, he understands class, and he was forced to understand race in a way that he didn't before.
Mhm.
And I can see, because I've noticed that he's gone after Kimberly Crenshaw multiple times. He's
Oh,
mentioned her multiple times, so he understands how intersectionality has been used to benign neglect Black boys and Black men. So
yeah.
right, so he gets it. At the end of the day, I do think that he still runs into the wall of these people want to maintain their position,
Yes.
and they don't care what the fallout is.
Mhm.
And going on what you were saying about um a certain cohort of women who sons are failing, but yet they're still putting up black girl magic, and excuse me, and they're we are definitely in the place where these people's ideology and their theories and their concepts trump the actual facts on the ground, and
Right.
they think if they can push hard enough
Yes.
that the things will change, they will force others to change,
Yeah.
right? And even
Yeah,
no matter how bad it gets, it's always, well, the reason it didn't work is because you didn't fully immerse yourself in the way I think,
exactly.
right? So,
Yeah.
that's the fallout of that. Whew.
Well,
And
that's
that's going to be horrible.
Tommy
But go ahead.
Tommy Curry. Tommy Curry once referred to that as the attempt to make attention outweigh death.
Oh yeah, I remember that. That's that. If there was no other reason to listen to Dr. Tommy Curry, the
Mhm.
first time I heard him say, "Let me get in my Army or say friend pod bag real quick," because that was the quote for me when
Yeah.
he said, "These people put attention over death," right?
Yes.
And he was speaking about the say her name movement, right? And he was speaking
Mhm.
about how it's like fighting for the attention. No, even after you see that the attention that's brought about from the death of black men doesn't actually garner justice necessarily, and
Right.
and yet you still want the attention, and that's where say her name comes from, right? And
Mhm.
when he said the attention over death, right, like you that was it for me. That's
Yeah.
when I was okay. Yeah, I'm a
And,
Dr. Tommy Curry, Jesus Christ,
yeah,
right?
see, and what you have with Curry is as much as we regard him, um, has he been given the attention that a Richard Reeves has, right? And Reeves is,
No.
I'm not saying Reeves is Johnny come lately. He's been doing his work, but
Mhm.
Curry's been putting it in on another level for years.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But we all know the politics. We
Mhm.
know how this works. We get that Reeves is very much clear he's a white man. He knows
Mhm.
that he's going to be heard in a way that a Tommy Curry
Mhm.
is not going to be. And to his credit, he's willing to still state what's true, especially around black men and boys. He's putting it
Mhm.
out there. I tip my hat to him for being willing to do that, because you can't assume that everybody will. I don't think
Mhm.
he's tripped into this accidentally. I don't think
No.
he's naive or ignorant about this. I think he's very purposeful. In fact, if I got him behind closed doors and put a beer in him and we had a conversation, I wouldn't be surprised if he was as frustrated about this shit as I am.
Mhm.
Just figured out that a better way for him in terms of his value system to get his point across without having to incur the wrath of the sisterhood is to pay them homage, quiet them down, and then on the back end say something that they would have normally been offended by. Hey, like I said, if it works for them, it works for them. If it turns into some policy that benefits men and boys, great. But at the end of the day, I think there's still a need for men to speak very forthrightly and not overly concede to being concerned about other people's feelings, and get to the point of what's true so we can actually have traction behind what's true. But anyway,
I
uh,
mean, if the personal is political, Dr. T, and that's a feminist tenet, right? If the personal is political, then why can't men engage in that also?
yeah,
Why can't we speak to men for men? Why can't the men sound just as angry as they actually are? I mean, this is something that I levied against FD Signifier. Are you attempting to tone police us, right? If the personal is political and you're attempting to tone police us, then what are you really saying,
yeah. Yeah,
right?
well, I think at the end of the day, male anger, of course, scares the shit out of people. I mean, the results can be disastrous. The results can be a 15-year-old kid with, an automatic rifle going into a grocery store or a school. I mean, the results of male anger scares the hell out of people, and I get it. But here's the problem. If you think the way to resolve that male anger is to ignore them and then to openly champion women and girls in their face and ignore them, okay, that's one way to go. But at the end of the day, this doesn't work that way. You have to actually, actually follow through on the lip service you've paid to being caring and nurturing and supportive, in the sense that you at least have to be willing to listen. And as of, as to date, we haven't seen a sincere willingness to listen on any mass level. I've clearly seen individual women. I mean, I have longstanding, women who've watched my show for years. I didn't expect it, but I was happy to see it. But on a mass level, do we really hear women being willing to listen? I'd say at best we're only starting to, because the state of the economy, and that doesn't suggest a willingness to listen, for any kind of credible reason. It just suggests a strategic need, which has its own problems. But anyway, all of that said, we'll see where this goes. I'm going to keep an eye on it. I think Reeves's feminism does a bit of a disservice to what his overall goal is, but I don't think he's oblivious as to why he's engaging that feminism. And I think this is a tactic we're going to see more of, especially from the academy, because you have so many in the academy and male scholars in particular that are terrified. Appreciate that, Ghetto User, and appreciate that, Joe, and Toya and Big Kev and Kay and Kareem. Appreciate that support. I think more men in the academy are so terrified about being canceled, but yet still see the weight and the reality of what we're saying, that it's going to force a response. So I think Reeves is giving them a PG kind of way to participate in the discussion that comes across as very naive, very, very, innocent in this. And then you got, people like, us that are over here like, no, just say the shit. Just say it, either way, choose which way you want to approach it. Understand how your piece moves on the board and operate strategically in making sure that we can improve the quality of life for these boys and these men. Any closing thoughts, Mr. Z?
I think you covered. Thank you for having me up. But like I said, Dr. Reeves, I look forward to seeing where this goes. I think he has a different approach. Well, clearly he has a different approach than us. I agree with you that maybe saying it a little bit more bluntly would be important. But if we're doing that and he's not, then that's okay. Let's see if his approach garners any more actual tangibles for men, young men, and boys, right? I do think that these people see it as a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
I think they only care about the fallout when it's time to get married and pick spouses and pick out homes and neighborhoods and zip codes. I think that's when it's like, oh, okay, now it's an issue, because on the back end of hoarding all of these opportunities, my daughter is struggling to find a husband. Like, I think that's when it's like, oh, what happened to the boys and men? But anything short of that, I don't think these people, it's not even that they don't care. They do care. They do care, but it's let me hoard this as much as possible, and I think that's okay. That's okay, except when it's time for the bill to come due on the other side. I think it's our job to then be the voice for our men, Black men specifically, and actually advocate for ourselves. And whoever comes along with us, that's great. If nobody does, well, there's going to be a consequence to that in overall society, and that's unfortunate. But I look forward to seeing where Dr. Reeves goes with this, and he has the ears of people that maybe we don't have the ears of.
He does, and we'll see where it goes. I would argue that if they do care, they don't care enough, because if you don't care enough to advocate for even your very own, and you're willing to sacrifice their advancement for the sake of a very small demographic, and it doesn't in any way mathematically make sense to alienate half of the community, if that's actually your the logic and the approach that you're going to go with, at this point the fallout is going to be what it is, and that's where it goes. And I've reached a point where I'm like, men just have to speak it and do what we have to do to advocate for where we are, because ain't nobody else coming. That's the fuck this is. They're not. So But anyway, man, thanks for coming on. And y'all got to know he came on with very short notice. So shout out to Mr. Z. Again, support his channel. Go over there, subscribe, listen to what the brother's doing. Check him out. I'm gonna let you roll, man. I know you're in the car, but thanks again, bro.
Thanks for having me up, Dr. T.
All right, man. Peace. All right. Shout out to Mr. Z. I'm curious to know your thoughts. I've had a chance to follow some of them in the live chat. Please make sure you contribute in the chat overall, and let me know what you're thinking. Let me know what your thoughts are about this. Do you see a rise of a politically correct manosphere, or is it just, a couple of individuals doing some work? What are your thoughts about this? I personally think they've been trying to, as Mr. Z said, sanitize the talking points, and it is what it is. Everybody's going to do that on one level or another. If it produces traction, I ain't mad about it. But at the end of the day, there's a certain integrity that I would like to see in terms of what this is, and it also should be tied to a frankness that I think needs to remain in play, as it were. But anyway, all that said, I want to hear your thoughts. I appreciate you supporting the show, and I will highlight y'all soon. Y'all have a good one. Peace. I am here to tell you, brothers, we are not criminals by birth, perennial rapists, incapable intellects, man-children, sperm donors, child support wellsprings, success objects, walking phalluses, ATM machines, lottery tickets, unintelligent henchmen, valueless assassins, pro bono mercenaries, unpaid bodyguards, interchangeable stepfathers, child discipline proxies, unpaid repairmen, workhorses, emotional tampons, or any other socially accepted dehumanizing stereotype. We are thinkers, inventors, innovators, leaders, fathers, and men. Embrace your humanity, know your worth, and extend your time, attention, and resources only to those who genuinely respect you. And remember, your worth is not defined by meeting other people's narcissistic, selfish, and unrealistic needs. You define your worth. Peace.